Imagine that your entire life was controlled by your childhood friend and that very friend. She simply turned out to be an S-rank idol and the granddaughter of the school principal. One day he finally snapped. No more obedience, no more leash. She wanted only one thing: freedom and an ordinary school life, but running away from it would not be a problem. The cold night wrapped the city. Thick clouds hid the moon and only occasionally let through dim light. The frosty air was dense with falling snow. Tiny Millie lay on the icy ground and suddenly felt herself freezing. She was abandoned on the steps of a stranger's temple, and the snow was already dusting her blanket. She felt that her short life was about to end. With each minute her crying grew quieter, and one thought spun in her head. How could they abandon her, a 5-month-old tiny baby, under the icy sky, with almost no chance of rescue? Memory returned her to the recent past, to a warm cradle, and before her parents were fiercely arguing. The father shouted that the child was not his, that the girl did not look like him, and the mother desperately denied it. Millie had seen these quarrels more than once. The heroine frowned a little. It seemed she was reborn as a baby in this house, retaining memories of her previous life. Having helplessly waved her hands several times, she tried to count. About 5 months had passed since she was reborn. In a distant corner of the room, a familiar maid stood modestly and watched what was happening. Millie looked at her parents. Their clothes and language showed that this was a completely different world. In her past life, she was a simple office worker from Japan, and she did not remember the cause of her death. Her memories were crystal clear: a simple family and the life of an office lady who adored store-bought sweets. Returning to reality, the heroine sadly looked at the adults who were arguing. It seemed that in this life she could not count on parental love. Meanwhile, the man loudly shouted that his wife did not even dare to impose a child from her lover on him. Then he abruptly left the room, slamming the door so loudly that everyone flinched at the unexpected sound, and Maria crossed her arms displeased and watched as her husband left. Suddenly she looked at the child. She quietly muttered that this bald girl only pushed her away, then angrily shouted at her not to even dare to look at her. Millie herself could not understand what was happening in her head. She involuntarily tilted her head back, as if trying to see the crown of her own head, because maybe her mother's words meant that she was bald, and for a girl, this was quite strange. But what scared her the most was her mother's behavior, and the girl looked at her with anxiety. The main heroine thought that this very much resembled postpartum depression. Maria angrily crossed her arms over her chest, wrapped herself tighter in her scarf, and noticed with irritation that the girl first cried, then strangely fell silent. It looked ominous. Because of this child, her husband began to suspect her of infidelity. She bitterly said that it was a cursed child. Millie sadly frowned upon hearing her mother's words. Maria glanced once more at the girl with hostility, then casually turned to the maid Mary, briefly asked her to look after her, and followed the man. The girl silently nodded to the lady, while the main heroine thought that although she had memories of her past life and perhaps had been deprived of her hair, she was still a helpless baby who needed care and protection. Then Mary gently smiled at the baby, approached the cradle, and leaned over it. She softly said that it was time to wash her bottom. The main hero, Raise or Fist, felt relief. The long-awaited moment had finally come. During the hygiene procedure, the maid carefully lifted the girl, gently hugged her, smoothly waved her hands, and quietly whispered a spell, deciding that the girl was now completely clean. Millie smiled happily. She thought what a wonder it was. Just one movement, and all unpleasant sensations instantly disappeared. Now she was completely sure magic really exists in this world, and she had verified it through her own experience. Suddenly a thought flashed through the main heroine's mind. What if she could also use these amazing abilities? Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and she immediately tried to repeat the graceful movements of the maid. Frozen and tense, she focused on pronouncing the magical words. But instead of a spell, only gentle baby babbling came out, and the girl froze in surprise. Then, a little irritated, she remembered that she still could not speak properly or control her movements. Mary, noticing her restless movements, gently stroked her back and asked anxiously if something was wrong. Millie, pressed against the warm breasts of the maid, thought with pleasant admiration that this was truly a completely different world, full of wonders. She eagerly imagined what incredible magic she would be able to possess when she grew up a little. Millie struggled to open her eyes. Her breathing was heavy and hoarse. The girl felt it was extremely difficult to breathe and tried with all her might to scream. Maria leaned over her, her face darkened with fear. At that moment, Mary was walking down the corridor with a lantern in her hand. As she approached the women's room, she suddenly heard a child's cry. The girl decided to enter and check. She carefully opened the door and asked what was happening, and Mary found it strange since this girl was usually so quiet at night. What she saw in the room shocked her so much that the lantern fell from her hands. Mary loudly called for the lady, trying with all her might to attract her attention, while the woman with a mad expression tried to strangle the child. The maid rushed to Maria, restrained her and begged her to stop, shouted for someone to come and help. Maria, whose voice was filled with madness, told the child that she would finally be able to cry properly. Her voice sounded like a dying animal. Millie continued to cry loudly out of fear. At that moment, the master of the house rushed into the room and sternly asked what was going on. Maria turned to the man and quietly muttered that the child was cursed and must die. While the lady was distracted, Mary quickly picked up the crying girl, held her by the clothes, and tried to calm her. The next moment Maria's face froze, she fainted and fell to the floor. Ahead the family sighed. He asked the maid to take the child to the church. Mary ran down the street, with each step moving away from the estate where she worked. She was breathing heavily and constantly looking back, because she knew that no one must find out that she was from the Nassif Trading Company and she should not be noticed. In her hands she tightly held the little lady, and the girl herself frowned displeased, thinking that she had been abandoned. Mary stopped near the abandoned chapel in the cemetery. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked at the child. With trembling hands she wrapped the girl more tightly in a blanket, placed her at the foot of the monument, and whispered quiet apologies. Suddenly turning away, she ran away. Millie lay motionless and watched the figure disappear. Large snowflakes fell on her face. The girl lay and looked at the sky. She thought her end had come. Millie looked around confused and noticed the tombstones dusted with snow. She thought that no one had come here. About 30 minutes passed. Millie raised her reddened and trembling hands to her head. Panic gripped her. She could die from the cold. Would her second life end in 5 months? In this life she did not even know her own name. Everyone just called her Mame. The girl began to cry even harder, silently begging God if he exists to save her right now. At the other end of the cemetery, a young couple was heading towards the exit. Suddenly, a girl named Marissa stopped and turned around, exhaling a frosty cloud, and told the man Joe that she clearly heard a baby crying. The boy hugged her shoulders and replied that it couldn't be on such a cold night in the cemetery. There couldn't be a baby. Marissa stubbornly said that the crying was coming from exactly there. The voices were sneaking up on Millie, and upon hearing footsteps, the girl realized she had to give a signal. She screamed at the top of her lungs. Her strength was fading. Her eyelids were closing. In the last second before she fainted, she noticed 2 blurry silhouettes leaning over her. When she woke up again, she was enveloped in deep warmth. She thought to herself that this might be heaven. Opening her eyes, the girl realized she was lying in Marissa's arms. Her husband Joe was standing nearby, and they both looked at her gently, with compassion, while she tried to look around. In response, the young couple smiled even warmer. Jolin addressed her, and relief was felt in his voice. He said they had fallen into despair seeing her so cold and motionless, and were infinitely happy when she finally opened her eyes. Marissa, meeting her embarrassed gaze, smiled quietly, and from the baby's face it was clear that it was completely puzzled and did not understand who these people were. Gently stroking the girl's head, Joe thoughtfully muttered that she must be about 4 or 5 months old. He could not understand how someone could abandon a child in such a place, and silently thanked fate that evening he and his wife had visited the grave of their deceased daughter Lisa. Marissa looked at the man, confused, while he gently stroked the smiling child. And she lowered her gaze. At that very moment, she lifted the girl to her face, hugged her tightly to her chest, and full of hope addressed the man. She said she felt it was fate, as if their child had returned, and suggested keeping the child. Remembering the children's things still lying in the house, Joe agreed, but cautiously noted that this girl was not their Lisa. Marissa smiled with mixed feelings and quietly whispered that she understood. But she still felt that God had brought them together, and how could she leave such a sweet girl? Joe, to lighten the mood, joked that the girl was strikingly bald, and no one knew if her hair would ever grow back. The main heroine was horrified. Her fears were confirmed. She really was bald. Marissa gently scolded her husband. You shouldn't rub a child's head like that, and noted that the baby did have hair. Joe looked closely and agreed that the hair seemed light. The girl thoughtfully muttered that it was just baby fuzz, and it was too early to say for sure about the color. Joe suddenly noticed that the baby needed a name, and Marissa, embarrassed, said there was no note on the clothes and asked if they could come up with a name for the girl themselves. Her husband straightened up in the chair and sat for several minutes, lost in thought. Then he suggested a name, Mariana. Marissa smiled and agreed that it was a wonderful name, so the girl became Mariana Spark and added briefly that they could call her Millie. The adults exchanged glances, looked at the child, and smilingly said that now they were her new mom and new dad. Tears welled up in the eyes of the main heroine. It had already been 4 or 5 months since her transformation, and every day she was subjected to angry shouts, and she had almost perished. She silently thanked these people for saving her, and the adults, noticing her tears, immediately became worried. A few months after Millie was taken into the family, they opened a modest tavern and named it Shadow Cat. It seems they bought it with wedding money and thanks to connections. Joe was the son of an elder who, having once escaped from humble origins, became a nobleman, and Marissa was the daughter of a wealthy merchant family. Growing up, Millie increasingly thought that her foster parents both came from wealthy families but got along very well with ordinary people. Although little was said about their relatives, she still sincerely hoped their business would be successful. But several years had passed since everything was opened. The situation did not change. The rooms were dirty and the food was tasteless. They had too many problems, so visitors came rarely. When Millie was very small, she lived carefree. She realized that if things continued like this, her whole family could end up on the street. The spark saved her life and raised her as their own. The girl resolutely decided to repay them for their kindness. Thus began the life of Amelia Spark, whose mental age was 30 years, and who devoted herself to caring for her foster family. Throwing her hands up, Millie mentally declared the start of her own operation, Repay with Kindness, and she would impoverish that suspicious cat. At first, the girl decided to tackle a very dirty room where stubborn stains, mold, and dirt were everywhere. Looking at it, she muttered that this was unacceptable. Suddenly hearing a strange sound, Millie turned around and froze in horror. Next to her lay a cockroach. The next moment she opened her eyes wide and sat up in bed. Looking around, the girl whispered with relief that it was only a dream. But looking at her real, equally dirty room, she realized it was true. She had to do something, and as soon as possible. Soon Millie went downstairs for breakfast. All the while she thought that she should start with cleaning, but how could she scrub off this ingrained dirt? Looking around the room, she thought that ordinary people in this world did not care much about hygiene. Judging by the very few visitors, it became clear Tavern was not the only bad place. For her, accustomed to the cleanliness of modern Japan, it was frankly hard to endure this filth. No one even washed their hands properly, and this was both a hotel and a restaurant. If it were cleaner, there would be more visitors here. These thoughts suddenly gave her a headache. She grabbed her temples and suddenly started crying, and her foster mother immediately ran over and anxiously asked what had happened. Marissa, trying to distract the girl, gently remarked that she really had very beautiful light hair. These words worked instantly, and Millie stopped crying. Joe joined the conversation, sat at the table next to his daughter, and seriously explained that among the aristocracy there were many blondes, so Millie might attract the attention of suspicious people, and for now it was better for her not to show herself unnecessarily, either in front of visitors or on the street. Marissa shook her head with a slight sadness, confirming that such a hair color could no longer be hidden under a hat. These words filled the main heroine with horror, so she wouldn't be able to help her parents in the tavern. The girl thought tensely. She needed to figure out how to get herself in order without showing up in public. Why don't you wash quickly and easily? Suddenly, distant memories from infancy returned to her. The maiden or her former family cast a spell over her to make her clean. She remembered that this was another world where magic existed. When Millie was a baby, she couldn't do this, but maybe now she could. Deciding to check this, the girl waved her hand over the dirty plate and whispered, "Klein." She froze for a few seconds, staring intently at the dishes. She helplessly dropped her shoulders. Nothing happened, and a bitter thought flashed through her mind. Her parents' magic seemed so simple, but she couldn't do anything. Somehow it had to be done. Millie jumped down from the table, said goodbye to her parents, and wished them luck at work. The adults smiled and waved back, and Marissa asked the girl to be quiet in her room. Climbing the stairs, the main heroine thought she needed something, any idea at all. But no thought came, yet she still decided to search. Maybe she would find something. Even if it seemed pointless, she felt she was growing up, because daily climbs to the 4th floor were exhausting, and how good it would be if there was an elevator in this world. Having entered the room, Millie carefully searched all the cabinets. But she found nothing remarkable, nothing that could be found just like that. Sighing heavily, she turned away. She could have asked her parents, but did not want to bother them for nothing. Suddenly she heard a light rustle behind her. Turning around, the girl saw a small box, previously hidden among other things. The box looked very sturdy. Fidgeting below next to him, he carefully opened the lid. Inside lay various jewelry rings, necklaces, pendants. But the only thing that truly caught her attention was an old book. The girl picked it up, and instantly it occurred to her that it looked very much like a book about magic. She was delighted, so such books really exist, and then Millie decided to try something like turning on the light. She flipped through the pages and stopped, mumbling to herself. It seemed she found exactly the spell to create a light bulb. Realization sparkled in her eyes. Somehow, it turned out she could read all these strange letters, a bonus for being reincarnated in another world. After a few hours, she finished reading the book, and the essence was that magic required awakening the innate magical power in a person, and to perform an action, it was enough to clearly imagine what she wanted. She froze for a moment, concentrating. She desperately wanted to try new desserts, especially those from the collaboration with a famous store. which in her previous life she pre-ordered at the 24-hour store back. Then she literally went crazy over food. Millie closed her eyes and immersed herself in bright memories of those treats. The next moment she noticed that her hands gently glowed. It seemed magic was awakening. The glow slowly faded, leaving only a faint tingling in her palms. The girl looked at her hands in confusion, mentally noting that the light had gone out, but now she clearly felt a new, warm power within herself. She resolutely raised her head and muttered that now, it seemed, she could do it. With a heavy sigh, Millie stood up, stretched her hands forward, and shouted loudly, "Light." And it worked. A small glowing ball hung in the center of the room. Touching it with her finger, she noticed that it emitted a soft light, but was not hot at all like a tiny light bulb. Encouraged by her success, she summoned another ball and then several more. In her imagination, she saw herself as one of the witches from fairy tales. But suddenly her vision began to darken, her strength rapidly faded, and at the last moment she weakly gasped. She muttered that she felt unwell, and her consciousness began to fade. After a few hours, she was awakened by a doorbell. Someone called Millie by name. Opening her eyes, she saw Marissa leaning over her. The woman asked anxiously why she was sleeping on the floor, holding some book close to herself. The girl stood up, rubbing her eyes, and looked around in confusion, wondering if she had really fallen asleep. Meanwhile, her adoptive mother picked up the book and gently remarked that books are expensive and should not be taken just like that. Putting it back in the box and barely paying attention to her mother's words, Millie thought to herself, maybe she fainted precisely because of a lack of mana. She had enough strength for only 5 small light bulbs, and that was very little. Rising from the floor, she crossed her arms over her chest, and with a slightly disappointed feeling, realized that she had not tried the cleansing spell, but she knew for sure she would not have had enough mana to clean the whole room, so what was she to do? The next morning, Millie decided to try yesterday's spell again and summoned several glowing spheres. And she froze in surprise. Yesterday, after 5 balls, she felt unwell, but today everything was fine. She felt as if a little more magical power had appeared in her body. Summoning another sphere, the main heroine thought that maybe if she trained every day, her mana reserve would gradually grow. A week later, near the counter in the tavern, Joe and Marissa were seeing off another guest, and suddenly the doorbell rang. The woman told the man that she would go check on their daughter. She went up to the girl's room. The name Marissa Coulter. From the threshold, she noticed Millie was lying on the floor in a strange pose, as if asleep. Quietly approached, lifted her daughter, and whispered anxiously that she seemed to have lost consciousness. To herself, she thought with worry that it looked scary, and quietly hoped it was not some illness. Later, Millie woke up in her bed, feeling completely rested. She sat on the bed and thought irritably that she had been caught again. Just at the moment, she fainted from lack of mana, and she did not want to trouble her parents for nothing, so she had to be more careful. As expected, her mana reserves gradually replenished with each training. Now she felt quite normal even after summoning 10 shining spheres. So she had no choice but to follow the same path. And day by day, while her adoptive parents suspected nothing, Millie diligently developed her magical skills. Her parents often found her in strange places and poses after another exhaustion, took away her magic book again, which she soon found again, and the girl herself continued to live happily with them. After a few months, the main character was already skillfully and confidently using cleansing. She also mastered the basics of fire, water, wind, and earth magic. Pride filled her. In a relatively short time, she managed to learn to use all the basic elements of this world. The magic book said that those who mastered several elements are an extraordinary rarity. Currently, only 5 people in the world are known to be able to control 3 elements. Millie noticed that everyone has their limits, and probably that is why cleansing spells are not used without need, so as not to exhaust all magic at once. She thought that the ability to control all elements was like a gift from reincarnation in another world, but decided to keep it a secret so that no one around would consider her strange. The most important thing was that now she had the power to repay her adoptive parents for their kindness. She descended for a moment into the main hall, where visitors were just sitting. Marissa was serving them. Peeking around the corner, Millie suddenly realized, right now is the perfect opportunity. She quickly wrapped a scarf around her head, hiding her blonde hair, because she thought her parents were too busy to notice. This meant she had time, and it was time to get to work. Having gone up to the guest floor, Millie immediately began applying cleaning to everything she saw, quickly tidying the rooms. In a few minutes, she was almost ready. Only one room remained, which she had just finished. Marissa appeared in the doorway, carrying her something to eat. The main character murmured with a bright smile that she barely made it and wiped her forehead with her hand. Her foster mother entered the room and announced that she had brought lunch. Marissa froze for a few seconds, looking around embarrassed. She said she did not remember this room being so shiny. It was unnaturally clean here. Handing her daughter a plate, she asked embarrassedly if she had washed it herself. Millie just shrugged, gratefully accepted the food, and said she only helped a little. The woman looked around the room again, mentally noting that cleaning such a large area would be difficult even for an adult, even if someone helped with the cleaning. Then she leaned toward the girl, gently stroked her head, and said that she was probably very tired, thanking her for the help. Millie happily nodded, accepting the thanks, but inwardly understood this was only the beginning. She had just started repaying them for their kindness and might even become a heroine or a saint, because her rebirth gave her all the chances. But in reality, she wanted only one thing: to live happily in this world with her new family. Millie sat at the table and began eating her lunch, while her parents smiled and wished her a good meal. Smiling outwardly, she stirred her plate with a spoon and thought that the food was not completely tasteless, but she was tired of eating the same thing every day, so everything seemed bland. After tidying up the tavern and making it cleaner, she had to come up with what to cook, and meanwhile Joe got up from the table and whistled some melody to himself. The main heroine finished eating and cleared the dishes, thinking that if she started cooking recipes from her past life, her parents would definitely be surprised. She even mastered magic and secrets, not wanting to bother them. When she carried the dirty dishes to the kitchen and thanked them for dinner, she thought that maybe it was worth at least telling them about cleansing and openly helping. Just at that moment, Marissa entered the room and called the girl by name. Slightly but worriedly smiling, she asked Millie to step out into the backyard for a minute, and Millie tilted her head embarrassedly but still followed her mother. The woman sat next to the bucket and began stirring something. She said that her daughter's hair had noticeably grown but remained the same, strangely light, and the girl silently looked at her, not understanding where this was leading. Marissa continued, saying that she really wanted Millie to be able to go outside and play as soon as possible like other children. The next moment, Marissa returned to her daughter with a smile, holding a brush dipped in a bucket with some strange dark liquid. The girl froze with horror but did not resist. Mom quickly dyed her hair, then went away to wash the bucket and told her to sit still a little longer. Millie only nodded, sitting wrapped in a towel so as not to get dirty. She was worried whether it was okay to dye her hair and whether everything would be fine after this scary green liquid. She was also troubled by the thought that the hairstyle might look too fancy or just strange. After some time, Marissa carefully helped her daughter wash her hair and with a satisfied smile said that now everything was fine, then asked Millie if she liked the result. The girl looked admiringly at her hair. Now it was a beautiful reddish-brown color, just like her mom's. Marissa poured the dirty water down the drain and with a smile said that from tomorrow her daughter could start meeting the neighbors. Millie smiled happily and thanked her. Millie and her mom went out to meet the neighbors and other children who came with their parents. Marissa introduced Mike from the tailor's workshop nearby and Nina from the butcher's shop, and both politely greeted the main character. The girl replied, said her name, and shaking my hand, joyfully said that she was very pleased to meet her. To herself, she happily thought that these neighborhood children might become her first friends. Mike then asked if Millie liked sweets. She answered that she simply adored them. The boy smiled from ear to ear and said that since they were now friends, he would take her to a special place. The main character, eyes full of curiosity, asked what kind of place this was. Soon they found themselves where many apple trees grew. Millie looked around excitedly, and her new friends happily watched her joy. Mike picked up an apple and explained that in the city such fruits cost 5 copper coins, but here in the forest, you can gather as many as you want for free. Nina, with a sweet but serious smile, added that this forest is considered dangerous, so they always go there only with adults. Hearing the price, Millie immediately remembered how her foster father Joe explained the money system to her. An iron coin costs 10 yen, a small copper coin 100 yen, a copper coin 1,000 yen, a silver coin 10,000 yen, a small gold coin 100,000 yen, and a gold coin 1 million yen. She calculated in her head that one apple costs about 500 yen. It turned out very expensive. Enthralled by the calculations, she fell a little behind her companions, and they immediately called her back. When she approached, Mike challenged her, who would gather more apples. Millie, unlike the other children, thought not about the game, but about the benefit free apple picking for 500 yen apiece was a great opportunity. But she wondered, could they really eat that many? Picking a fruit, she remembered how in her past life she often baked apples. Soon she returned home with a full basket and offered her parents to prepare a dish she once made herself. This greatly surprised the adults. The main heroine explained that she wanted to bake apples and call it apple chips. Joe just laughed in response and remarked that if you put such juicy apples in a hot oven, they would simply spoil and turn into mush. The girl boldly flashed her eyes and asked if her father was sure about it. Then she moved closer and bravely said, "In the kitchen, the most important thing is not to be afraid to make a mistake. Honestly, she was tormented by the thought of whether she should reveal that she knew dishes from a past life that simply did not exist in this world. But every day was the same milk, soup, or vegetable. She desperately wanted something sweet. Since she was reborn, she had never had a proper snack, and as soon as this thought crept into her mind, she could no longer drive it away. Sitting next to her parents, she thought that her family was not the type to immediately call someone strange. Memories of her past life, her ability to control all the elements, all of this seemed too incredible, and she was not going to talk about it. But Millie did not want to hide absolutely everything from her parents. Joe smiled, sighed, and nodded, agreeing to try his daughter's recipe. He had already reached for an apple when Millie stopped him. The next moment she applied cleansing to her parents' hands, and the adults watched their daughter's actions with wide-open eyes. Joe froze for a moment and asked how she managed to use magic. The main heroine frowned slightly and answered decisively and directly. She practiced while her parents were at work. Marissa silently and intently watched her daughter. Then her face lit up. She understood. She approached her daughter and asked with interest if it was true that her room had been so clean lately because she had been cleaning it with magic. Millie nodded tensely, thinking to herself that it was better not to recall how much area she actually had to clean. Meanwhile, Joe began to recover from the shock. With trembling hands and stammering, he said that his daughter, without any training and at such a young age. Ben's face literally lit up. He put his hand to his mouth and exclaimed, "Are you a genius?" Hearing these words, the main hero froze in confusion. She wondered why her parents took it all so easily. The adults, not noticing her embarrassment, began enthusiastically discussing that she was looking at a book about magic. Maybe she could even read. Then they both turned to the girl and, serious but with warm excitement, asked her to be careful and not to use too much magic because magical power can also run out. Marissa nodded in agreement and added that the girl was only 4 years old. Millie smiled at both of them and mentally noted that although her parents were a bit frivolous, she liked them very much. Next to them, she could be herself as much as possible, openly and loudly, and simply gladly agreed with their words. Our next move is to cleanse the fruit. She solemnly announced that it was time to start making apple chips. First, thinly slice the apples, then put them in the oven and bake, carefully regulating the temperature so they don't burn. As soon as the slices became crispy, they could be taken out and tasted. Millie, with a smile on her face, pulled the ready apple chips from the oven and announced that the preparation was complete. Joe looked at the snack with interest and felt that it smelled pleasant. Marissa added that she just couldn't wait to try them. And everyone took a piece. For a few seconds, a tense silence hung in the air. After this, the faces of the adults literally lit up with delight. The apples were incredibly tasty, so crunchy that one could easily become addicted to them. Joe turned to his daughter and asked if she had indeed gotten what she wanted. The girl could not utter a single word. She barely held back tears of joy. She hadn't tasted anything sweet for so long. With shining eyes and an overly serious expression, she said that her dad was the best and showed him a big thumbs up, while Joe just looked at this strange gesture in surprise but decided to ignore it. Then Millie, stammering a little, suggested, "What if we treat the tavern visitors to these apple chips?" The adults exchanged glances and nodded in agreement. They decided tomorrow they will definitely try it. Marissa listened to her daughter and offered the puzzled visitors a new delicacy. They cautiously tasted the apple chips. And the icy bliss, one of them exclaimed that they were incredibly crispy and tasty, and the second immediately asked for more. Millie hid behind the corner and watched the scene. A thought flashed through her mind. What if other knowledge from a past life could be useful in the kitchen? But the apple chips were just a snack. She dreamed of inventing a real dish that could become the signature highlight of their tavern. Soon her father approached her and with a broad smile announced that her apple chips had huge success among the guests. And as a reward, she truly deserved a real steak. Seeing the appetizing piece of meat in front of her, the girl froze with admiration. Cutting off a piece and tasting it, she moaned with pleasure to herself. She noticed that it seemed pork also existed in this world, and when Joe, noticing her expression, asked if orc meat was really incredibly tasty, Millie automatically nodded in agreement. But for a moment she froze. Only then did she realize what her father had just said. Her father, not noticing her hesitation, simply joked that if she didn't eat quickly, the steak would get cold. Suddenly an image flashed in her mind, a huge pig-like creature on its hind legs, clutching a crude weapon, and it turned out to be the same orc she had so often encountered in games. She had just swallowed one of those tears that appeared in her eyes, and Joe immediately became worried, asking what had happened. The main heroine did not answer, frozen in thought. She silently thanked the orc for his sacrifice and decided to eat the meat with gratitude. It was so delicious that it was hard to stop, although the familiar image of that game job kept surfacing in her mind. Suddenly, the girl froze. Suddenly, she had a new idea. If there is pork or at least orc meat in this world, she could cook exactly that dish. Then she will be able to cook exactly that dish. Katsu crispy on the outside, juicy on the inside. When you bite into it, the meat seems to melt in your mouth. It is simply sinfully delicious. Of course, these were only her guesses, but when frying such meat in hot oil, it seemed something incredible would happen, so she immediately suggested to her father to add this new dish to the menu. Joe stood opposite her, arms crossed over his chest, and skeptically remarked that frying meat in oil was a waste of a valuable resource. Millie immediately shouted at him threateningly. Her eyes flashed. She asked what was the most important thing in cooking. Her father just laughed awkwardly, then, becoming much more enthusiastic, repeated her words. A fearless heart does not fear defeats, and when the apple chips turned out wonderful, so why not try? A little later in the kitchen, the main heroine listed everything down to the last detail: eggs, flour, bread, working meat, salt, and spices. But a happiness in this world, there was also flour and seasonings. Yosted stood a little behind her. He, somewhat doubting, asked if she really remembered everything correctly, and how exactly she intended to cook it. The girl just smiled broadly in response and assured him that everything was fine. At first, she had to carefully make small cuts on the thinly sliced pieces of orc meat so they would not deform during frying, then sprinkle them with salt and spices. After that, the meat had to be coated in flour. And just dip it in beet nug. Joe could no longer stand it and exclaimed indignantly that it was so wasteful to use such valuable ingredients. Millie, a little irritated, asked him to just watch and not interfere. Then she rubbed the bread to make breadcrumbs and carefully coated each piece of meat in it. Standing on a small stool and holding a bottle of oil, the main heroine asked her father to add fire. Joe asked in horror, "Are you really going to fry all this in oil?" When the girl without hesitation poured significantly more oil into the pan than he considered reasonable, he almost jumped up and shouted that it was an unacceptable waste of valuable ingredients. Millie completely ignored his shouts. She carefully immersed the breaded pieces of meat in the boiling oil. She explained that it needed to be well fried on all sides, and as soon as a uniform golden crust appeared, the dish would be ready. Then she took out the finished Orc Katsu and placed it on a plate. With a triumphant smile, she handed it to her father and invited him to try it while it was still hot. Joe looked at the dish with distrust and sniffed. Then he carefully cut off a piece and tried it with trepidation. His face immediately lit up, and he exclaimed that it was really delicious. He thought that with the egg and breading it would turn out strange, but it turned out quite good. Millie bit off with enthusiasm. In her soul, she was delighted. This was a real Tom Katsu from her past life, and she was incredibly happy. But in a moment, her face clouded over. She frowned and muttered discontentedly that something was missing. Her father was surprised. It tasted quite normal, but the girl, folding her arms on her chest, said disappointedly that this was not Tom Katsu. Joe asked what she was talking about. But the main character was already deeply thinking what was wrong. The meat seemed not juicy enough, and the texture was not quite right. She thoughtfully muttered that maybe if it were fried twice, the meat would become crispier. She looked seriously at her father and said that they would definitely try to get there tomorrow. Finishing his part, the man said that he had already thought about adding this or katsu to the menu as a new dish, but seeing her dissatisfied expression, he sighed and promised not to do it until she was completely satisfied with the result. He would help her experiment. Millie lit up at these words and joyfully asked if he would help her with the experiment. He sighed and promised not to do it until she herself was completely satisfied with the result. He would help her with the experiment. Millie shone at these words and sincerely thanked her father. Since then they hunt every day for the perfect recipe or katsu and constantly try something new. Test sample number 2. The meat was cut too thick, inside it remained raw. Test sample number 3. The oil overheated and the meat burned. Test sample number 4. The breading crumbled and the meat itself turned out tough. At some point, Millie was completely disappointed. She did not understand why it got worse every time, since the first, or katsu, was much better. She sat and drowned in self-reproach until her father found her. He looked at his upset daughter with a gentle, understanding smile, sighed quietly, and approached her. He gently stroked her head and asked, "What is the most important thing in cooking?" The main heroine turned to him with tears in her eyes, stammering a little, and said that it is a fearless heart that is not afraid of failure. The man smiled broadly upon hearing her words, placed his hands on his hips, and firmly said that since she herself taught him this motto, they would definitely manage together, so there is no point in losing heart. He went to the table and with renewed enthusiasm began rubbing bread to make fresh breading for the next attempt, and Millie looked at his cheerful back, thinking that even if he did not fully believe in her childish ideas about cooking, he was still ready to try again and again. That is why she had to stand her ground. She had to prepare a dish that everyone at the Shady Cat Inn would love. Millie decided to go over her past failures once more and figure out where and what went wrong. The first and most important, the thickness of the meat. It should not be cut too thin. But it had to be such that it was easy to bite. She thoughtfully watched as her father cut the meat and corrected him, thicker or thinner. Next, it was necessary to adjust the oil temperature radially around 170 degrees. Joe heated the oil and asked if everything was okay. Millie nodded in agreement, then put a small pot on her head like a helmet and covered herself with one of the lids. Dad, sensing her mood, also covered himself with the lid like a shield and carefully lowered the piece of meat into the oil. And immediately everything splattered in all directions. A few drops fell on his hand, he exclaimed in surprise. The heroine exclaimed that the batter had started to slip a little, and that it was probably worth lowering the heat. The father nodded in agreement, and still wary of hot splashes, carefully did as she asked. Their goal was simple, just to slightly brown the meat by frying it over a steady, not too hot fire. The third goal was to perfect the breadcrumbs. They had to be thin and crumbly, and it was very important not to make a mistake with the size. To do this, they called upon Marissa's magic for help, and she gladly joined, carefully using magic to dry and grind the breadcrumbs, occasionally asking her daughter if the result satisfied her, while Millie watched with shining eyes and finally nodded contentedly. As soon as the perfect breadcrumbs were ready, the prepared meat could be carefully covered with them. The fourth step is to choose the most suitable oil for frying. Millie had several bottles of different oils in front of her. Joe smiled slightly and noted that during their numerous attempts he had managed to buy almost everything he could at the market. Millie happily clenched her fist, thanked him, and suggested testing each of the oils as soon as possible. After several trials and errors, they finally found the perfect oil. Joe carefully took out the already fried pieces from the hot oil and explained that they need to be cooled a bit, and then fried again, crispy on the outside, but still too raw inside. Then, a little proudly, he showed his daughter the new set of cutlery and asked if these chopsticks would do. Millie took them and said excitedly that they were just perfect. So they moved on to the fifth step, painting. It turned out that in this world, quality kitchen utensils cost a fortune, and when the main heroine casually mentioned chopsticks, her father decided to make them for her. He could not make out her usual shapes and did not understand how to use them, so in the end they agreed on a form resembling coal tongs, more convenient and simpler for him. And so attempt, after long hours of reflection, by trial and error, through hard tedious work and falling asleep right in the kitchen from exhaustion, they finally succeeded. Ideal, or katsu, the one she dreamed of. Finally, the long-awaited day of the new dish's presentation arrived. The guests began to descend to the common room and were immediately greeted by an incredible, tempting smell wafting from the kitchen. The guests inadvertently glanced in that direction. Then Marissa approached them with trays neatly arranged with portions, and with a light, businesslike smile, announced that today the tavern's menu featured a new dish. Suspicious Kat's signature, or katsu. Just glancing at the plates, some guests involuntarily swallowed. One of them even asked if it was really orc meat right in front of him. Still somewhat doubting, they pierced the crispy crust with forks. But unable to resist the tempting aroma, they decided to try. The entire Spard family held their breath, watching their reaction. Millie froze in anticipation. Would they really say nothing? Shouldn't they like this dish? In a moment, the room exploded with delighted exclamations. The guest praised the dish, how juicy and crispy it was, how incredibly delicious the meat was cooked, which was simply impossible to stop eating, and everyone liked it so much that many immediately asked for seconds. Millie and her parents exchanged glances, and simultaneously, as if on cue, they clapped their hands, happily whispering to each other how well everything turned out. Seeing Marissa serving some second and even third portions to others, the girl thought it was a great sign. If Orc Katsu became popular, more people would definitely come to their tavern. And already the next week, she barely woke up in the morning, still sleepy, went down for breakfast after wishing everyone good morning, took a plate from her smiling father, and sat at the table. Joe was slightly puzzled. From early morning, some unusual noise could be heard outside. He decided to go and see what was going on, while his daughter and wife looked at him with curiosity. Shrugging, they both resumed eating, but Marissa still asked if something had happened. Suddenly, a scream rang out. Nervous Joe ran into the room and shouted that something terrible had happened. Millie and Mom looked out the window and froze in shock. In front of the door of their tavern, a huge crowd had gathered, several dozen people, far more than ever before. The entire Spark family went outside and froze on the threshold, stunned by what they saw before them. Millie himself shouted, asking what was happening. Noticing his daughter's concern, Joe approached the nearest person in the queue. It turned out to be an experienced traveler, and asked him the same question. The man, with a broad, good-natured smile, explained that the food in their tavern had already become a legend among adventurers. Rumors were going around that one could taste an unheard-of dish made from orc meat, one that no one had cooked before. He wanted to try it so much that he came early in the morning, and there was already a long line. These words made the main heroine rejoice inwardly. She could not believe that everything had happened in just a week. The rumors spread so quickly. It was incredible luck. Millie decisively called her parents, clenching her tiny little hands into fists. She was met with surprised looks. She firmly said that this was their long-awaited chance. Now they could not waste a minute, and under no circumstances had the right to give up. She suggested finally reviving the tavern. Marissa and Joe exchanged glances. Their daughter's determination touched them too. They both nodded, and the same spark shone in both their eyes. Their mother grabbed Millie by the hand and almost ran into the house to start cooking, while Joe stayed on the doorstep and loudly announced to the crowd that everyone would be served, but they would have to wait their turn a little. Since then, the stream of visitors has not stopped for a single day. There was not a minute of peace in the tavern, and Millie worked alongside the adults, helping as much as she could. Those were very intense but incredibly rich days. And on one of those evenings, after closing the tavern, the three of them sat silently in the kitchen, and Joe groaned, straightening his back, confessing that he did not remember the last time this week he was so exhausted. Marissa handed him a cup of hot tea with a soothing smile, gently noting that today they really worked well. The man nodded gratefully. After taking a sip, he sincerely admitted that he never thought his daughter's invention Katsu would become so popular, so despite the fatigue, he had no complaints. The main heroine laughed awkwardly and agreed that she was also surprised. But determination sparkled in her eyes. This was only the first step. Then she carefully turned to her father and awkwardly apologized for bothering him when he was so tired. She began listing other ideas: fried chicken with salt and lemon, dumplings with fish sauce instead of soy sauce, hamburger steak, and orc meat fried with ginger. After all, there were so many favorite dishes from her previous life that they could try to cook, so Joe, though exhausted, listened to her, then sighed deeply and smiled, agreeing that they could try. Millie immediately exclaimed that he was the best, and as with Orc Katsu, they began preparing trial versions of new dishes, refining the taste day by day. The main character thought, if they serve only Orc Katsu every day, their establishment would very quickly become known for just one hit. And the real goal was to get regular clients. She smiled resolutely to herself and thought that they could develop a completely new menu. Perhaps that was the advantage of being 30 at heart, the ability to look at things strategically. After some time, again at dinner, the girl approached her parents with a new idea. What if they added all these new dishes to the menu and offered them as a tasty set of the day? The adults looked at each other and smiled. It was a wonderful idea. Joe, a bit surprised, asked how such ideas even come to her. Millie cheerfully raised her hands up and exclaimed that it just comes by itself. Marissa looked at them with a warm smile. She was thoughtfully looking at the table and muttering to herself what else could be invented to make their tavern better. Joe looked at her with a gentle smile. He gently stroked her hair and said that her ideas were truly impressive. With a light, slightly awkward smile, he added that her help in the tavern was very helpful to them, but running around all day when you are still a child is probably tiring. She can always rest a little if she wants. Millie froze for a second in surprise. She asked herself, is this really parental care? A broad smile lit up her face. She replied that everything was fine and that she would also try her best like a true assistant. To convince, she gave a thumbs up. She thought she had just begun to repay the couple who sparked the flame for their kindness. Joe asked what this strange gesture meant, but his question went unanswered. Millie, who was delivering the order, thought that although the last days had been tense, the flow of visitors had finally calmed down a bit and returned to normal. At that moment, the doorbell rang, and two men entered the tavern. The first pleasant-looking, with an open face, the second wrapped in a cloak with a deep hood hiding his featureless main character, immediately approached them and greeted them politely. She asked if they came only to eat. The first man replied Nathi would like to rent a room. Millie nodded and pointed to the reception desk. The young man said he was glad to finally get to the tavern everyone had been talking about lately. Meanwhile, his companion gloomily glanced around the room, barely turning his head. And then the girl remembered, since they are renting a room, she needs to know their names. The first guest introduced himself as Zach. Then he praised Millie, saying that although she is small, she is very collected. In response, the main heroine politely introduced herself. Zach warmly smiled, mumbling that she was so sweet, and then Millie asked what his companion's name was. The man in the cloak slowly turned his head toward her side. Zach immediately apologized, awkwardly hugged his companion by the neck, and said that his real name was Will, that he had just joined the squad as a rookie, and that he was a loner. We stood patiently beside him, and he radiated silent displeasure. Not letting him go, Zach pulled the boy toward the stairs, waved goodbye, and said that they were very tired from the journey and would rest in their room until dinner. Millie muttered to herself with an embarrassed smile that he is very active, and Marissa, who was watching the scene, thanked her daughter for the help. In the evening, Zach and Will went down to have dinner, and Zach's eyes blazed with excitement. He devoured one serving after another, constantly amazed at how delicious everything was and how he had never tasted anything like it before. She quietly sat down next to him, barely touching his food. The main heroine stood by the table and, smiling, said that she was very pleased to hear such praise. Zach, with a piece of Orc Katsu on his fork, froze and looked at her, couldn't help but ask where such a little girl got such manners. It was incredible. Millie gently took the edge of the dress and lightly bowed, replying that it was simply manners befitting a young lady. Zach repeated her words with an awkward but kind smile, addressing his silent companion as if expecting some reaction, which, however, did not come. She thought that most common people were usually quite rude, so she aimed to be polite and attentive. With a barely noticeable smile, she thought to herself that this was probably how she would have behaved in a previous lifelet. The nobles find it strange. She did not care. When Emil finished, Zach thanked the girl for the dinner and asked how much they owed. Millie paused for a moment, quickly calculated, and announced that the dinner with Orc Katsu would cost 8 small copper coins each. Zach took 2 coins from his pocket, said he only had ordinary copper coins, and asked if they could give him change. Holding a small pouch of small coins in her hands, Millie began counting in her head. 1 copper coin equals 10 small coppers. After a short pause, she confidently announced that their change would be 4 small coppers. The men exchanged brief, surprised glances. We will try to hide his surprise by sipping from his cup, and then they will briefly thank them for the food, and went up to their room. At the threshold, Zach sighed heavily and said that although the food was unusual, it turned out to be tasty. Will simply nodded in response. Ignoring this, Zach continued, talking about the inn where a night costs 3 copper coins. The inn was incredibly clean. He only briefly nodded, watching his talkative companion intently. His companion, still good-naturedly, added that the girl Millie, whom they had seen, was really very clever. But dark-haired Will interrupted him and asked if it all did not seem strange to him. Zach blinked embarrassedly and asked what he had encountered. He couldn't stand it. He leaned over the boy and irritably explained that it was about a girl. There were too many strange moments in her. She looked only 5 years old, but where did she get such manners, and how could she count so quickly and accurately, especially in such a place for ordinary people? Zach swallowed hard and tried to calm him down, saying that she might be extraordinarily smart. But calling her strange or talking about such banal things was simply rude. Besides, Millie was very sweet. A deep sigh seemed to say that with such optimism, Zach probably had a very easy life. As soon as they entered the room, we will dim the small table lamp, and sat at the table. Zach, taking off his travel clothes, asked if he was going to write another report. Then he added that getting a promotion was not easy. It was clear that carrying out the order, pretending to be an adventurer, and gathering information in the city was not simple at all. Zach lay down on the bed and said he was going to sleep, advising Will to do the same, and Will only said, "We'll just ask him to be quiet," took a pen and unfolded a sheet of paper. As for the situation in the city, nothing special was noticed. The one who is standing at the end, now there are rumors about him. Nothing remarkable, but just in case I'll say one thing, there is a strange child in the establishment. Her behavior, manner of speaking, and even her ability to count do not fit at all with her surroundings or her age. Her name is Mariana, but she is best known by the nickname Millie. After some time at the other end of the city, in a luxurious mansion, the butler quietly walked down the corridor, carefully pushing a tea table with exquisite sweets in front of him. He knocked his knuckles on the massive oak doors, apologized for the disturbance, and announced that he had brought tea, and after receiving permission to enter, he froze in the doorway before the master, who was just finishing reading a report sent by one of the agents, his gaze sliding over the last lines about a strange girl from some tavern, and with a light, interested hoarseness. The young, attractive man with light hair pronounced her name aloud, adding that he was interested in this unusual child. On the table in front of the main heroine stood many of her favorite dishes. Admiring all this wealth, she thought to herself that, to fulfill her little whim, rather, for the sake of the welfare of that shadowy catch, had asked her adoptive father to prepare all this. Lately she had even begun to get used to life in this world, and from this very thought, a warm wave swept through her. And finally the day came, the birthday of Millie, when she turned 5 years old. The parents sincerely congratulated their daughter, and she responded with the widest and happiest smile, thanking them for everything. Marissa handed her a hair ribbon and, smiling, said that it was her gift. The main heroine blossomed with joy and accepted this decoration with delight. She immediately asked to have it tied on her head like a headband, and her mother fulfilled her request with a gentle smile. Millie thought that her real birth date in this world was unknown. Her birthdays were usually not celebrated individually, but as general seasonal holidays. She was picked up in winter when she was about 5 months old, so they decided to consider midsummer as her official birthday. Happily touching the new decoration on her head, the girl quietly hummed something, and Marissa looked at her and smilingly said that the ribbon suited her very well. Millie eagerly scanned the festive table and suggested sitting down to eat quickly before everything got cold. "Enjoy your meal, everyone." The parents exchanged warm glances and looked at their daughter with tenderness. Joe fell silent for a moment, decided that this was the right moment, and spoke while Millie was eating. The girl froze with a fork halfway to her mouth, but then resumed eating and listened attentively. He quietly cleared his throat, feeling a bit shy. He announced with a smile that at the beginning of next year, Millie would become an older sister. The eyes of the main heroine widened in surprise, and she froze for a moment with a full mouth. Seeing her reaction, Marissa covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hide a joyful smile, while Joe hugged her shoulders and gently rubbed his cheeks out of embarrassment. Millie mentally asked herself if she had understood everything correctly. Could it be that she would really become an older sister? Realizing what had just been said, her face lit up with a broad, radiant smile, and she immediately congratulated her parents, her eyes sparkling with happiness. But in her soul, she smiled slightly. Of course, it was wonderful news, but when did they find the time for this? Probably that very night, when she stayed overnight at a friend's house, it happened. Perhaps it is not very tactful to think about such things, but the main thing is that her parents are happy and everything is fine with them. The adults, noticing her strange smile, exchanged embarrassed glances, and Joe asked why she was smiling. Millie, folding her arms on her chest and with a sweet, innocent expression, replied that it seemed to her that today was the best birthday. Marissa's eyes filled with tears of emotion, and Joe, gathering himself, moved on to practical matters. He explained that because of this news, Marissa would now have to avoid heavy work, and he was already thinking of hiring someone to help, although that could be discussed later. Millie exclaimed enthusiastically that from now on she would help them even more than before, and her father smiled warmly and said that she was their most beloved and irreplaceable helper. Carol decided, for the sake of the future little brother or sister who will be born soon, she would now try twice as hard. A few days later, a doorbell announced her return, and a child's voice joyfully exclaimed, "She's home." Entering the kitchen, Millie poured 25 collected apples onto the table, because she and Mike occasionally held competitions to see who could gather more, and the boy always lost, while Joe, standing next to the table, noticed that this time she had brought quite a lot. He thoughtfully added that Gordon, Mike's dad, had helped again by watching over her. Maybe they should bring them something as a thank you, but recently they had already treated them to apple chips. Suddenly Millie exclaimed that she had a great idea. After some time under her careful guidance, Joe baked a delicious apple pie. The girl took a piece, tasted it, and happily said it was very tasty, and in her thoughts she noted with relief that she had worried in vain about the lack of sugar. The natural sweetness of the apples turned out to be just enough. Joe also took a piece, bit into it, and sighed with pleasure, saying the pie was wonderful and simply incredible, and she looked at her father with a slight smile, thinking that he had really become a much better cook, and that now was the time to experiment with other sweets. Then Joe asked if Millie could take the pie to Mike's house tomorrow. The girl immediately agreed happily. The next day at Mike's house, the boys saw the treat in Millie's hands, eagerly swallowed, and asked what this incredibly appetizing thing was. The main character smiled and explained that it was called apple pie, then asked to send his regards to his father. Mike gladly agreed, but then frowned and declared defiantly that next time he would definitely gather more apples than she did. Millie laughed awkwardly and hurriedly agreed. Taking the treat from the girl's hands, Mike waved goodbye, explaining that buyers would soon come and he needed to watch the shop. Millie smiled and said she was leaving. She was about to go out. Suddenly, the door right in front of her refused to open. The blow hit her right in the forehead. The girl quietly gasped in surprise and pain and fell to the floor. The man who opened the door instantly reached out his hand to help her up and anxiously asked if she was okay, and the main heroine, still a bit stunned, nodded. Putting her small hand in his palm, she allowed him to lift her. Then he asked if she was from the tavern. Millie looked up at him and recognized the unsociable guest who had recently stayed with him, Mr. Will. She thought to herself, had he forgotten? Where was he? After all, this was a sewing workshop. Will loudly repeated his question, asking why the girl was here. The main heroine explained that yesterday she and Mike were picking apples, and now she had brought a pie they baked with her father. We asked if they went to the forest alone, it's dangerous, but the girl immediately clarified that adults were with them, so he did not worry. The man asked again, can't they just buy apples somewhere nearby? Millie's eyes widened in surprise. Her face darkened and she rushed at him. She began to speak indignantly, asking if he even imagined how much an apple costs, a whole 5 small copper coins. Her pocket money had just been slightly increased, and now she was given only 2 coins a week, so to buy just one apple, she would have to save for almost 3 weeks. And yesterday in the forest she picked 25 apples at once, so to buy that many, she would have to save for about 63 weeks. We step back, he presses his hand to his chest, and mutters that the only thing he understood is that she really has very little money. At that moment, a voice suddenly sounded from behind the door. It's not about the money. And it was exactly that which was to blame. The next moment, a young, incredibly attractive man with a clearly aristocratic appearance and light hair entered the room. He was wiping tears from laughter, then apologized to the girl, explaining that his friend was simply a weirdo. Millie opened her eyes wide and mentally noted that Mr. Will's friend was strikingly handsome. The man leaned slightly to be at her level, introduced himself as Leo, mentioned the heat and other colleagues, and the girl politely gave her name in response. She thought that if Leo was also an adventurer, then they were both seemingly made for such a business, and she would never have guessed. Then Leo said that to apologize for his friend's rudeness, he would like to give her a small gift. He extended a small, neatly wrapped piece of something. Millie looked at it with great interest and suddenly caught a painfully familiar rich aroma. Leo quickly explained that it was chocolate, but the main character did not listen to the end, grabbed the candy from his hands and thanked him. Her eyes shone, she examined the chocolate in her palm, and rejoiced inwardly at the thought that chocolate existed in this world too. It was incredibly cool. Leo looked puzzled at her explosive reaction. Then he slowly said that it seemed she already knew what chocolate was, but it was so rare that even in the capital not everyone had heard of it. The girl awkwardly, somewhat cunningly, explained that she had heard about chocolate from a merchant client. She added that it seems you can make many different treats from this. The man asked with interest what exactly she was going to make, and Millie shrugged and said she would go home and think about it there. She was already about to say goodbye, but Leo shouted after her and asked her to wait. He sincerely admitted that he really wanted to see what treat she would make and asked if she would mind if he went with her. The main heroine shyly replied that she didn't mind, but... However, soon all three of them found themselves in the tavern kitchen. Joe also got interested and joined, and Millie stood before them like a chef, seriously cleared her throat, and declared that she would try to make scones with chocolate that Mr. Leo had given her. All three looked at her puzzled, not understanding what she was talking about. Noticing their embarrassment, she decisively said that one way or another, they had to start with enthusiasm. She raised her fist, and the man, a little embarrassed, repeated her gesture. First, she continued, everyone needs to wash their hands thoroughly, and mentally noted that it was better not to use magic around people. He shrugged and did as she asked. Millie announced that it was time to make her special scones. First, the chocolate had to be chopped into small pieces, which Mr. Leo took on under the watchful eyes of the others. And the necessary ingredients had to be mixed and the dough rolled out, which was entrusted to Mr. while the others watched, focused and a bit clumsy, but with smiles, and Millie somewhat regretted that if they had real butter or sugar, everything would turn out much tastier, but such products were not yet affordable for them. Only slow baking of the dough in the preheated oven under Joe's careful supervision remained. And the chocolate gangsters were already ready. Millie nostalgically recalled that in her previous life, she had often made such a simple snack. Leo looked with interest at the result of their joint work and admitted that he had never seen anything like it before. Well, not him, silently agreeing. Millie decided she would be the first to try one. Taking a bite, she literally melted with happiness the familiar taste of chocolate, which she had not tasted for so long. Joe Adiscons was silent, but his pleasure was visible to everyone. Leo muttered that it turned out quite well, and Will dryly added that it reminded him of some pastries served in the capital. He watched the video, then added that he had never imagined that chocolate could be used to create something so delicious. Only one scone remained. Millie immediately grumbled that no one dared to touch it. Leo, with a sly smile, said that since it was the last one it was still worth fighting for. Joe tried to smooth over the beginning quarrel, reminding that behaving like that with guests was rude. After some time, Leo sighed deeply and admitted that it was very tasty. But he had not imagined that scones would turn out to be so filling. We cast a dissatisfied look at his companion and mentally marked his childish behavior. Meanwhile, Joe calmed the clearly upset Millie, gently telling her that she had already eaten enough. Leo noticed that their menu seemed to have suddenly acquired many unusual dishes and asked if they planned to patent these recipes. The girl embarrassedly turned back to him. Let's explain, a patent makes the idea yours, others can use the recipe only for a fee, and due to the uniqueness of these dishes, the simplest one can cost about 5 copper coins, and some even a small gold coin. Even if the recipe was stolen, the patent owner would have the legal right to compensation. Millie remarked with interest that this is indeed an interesting system. Joe Froose immersed himself in thoughts, pondering what he had heard. Suddenly we will announce that it is time for them to leave. Leo nodded in agreement. He added that today was very fun, said goodbye, and promised that they would meet again. A little later, on the way home, Leo asked his companion if Millie was really the girl from the report and if he could confirm it. Leo then noted she's somehow strangely mature the way she speaks, and the ability to invent complex recipes do not at all resemble an ordinary child. Those interested in her possible magical potential would say that she apparently has not yet been tested for magical power, although at her age this should have already been done. Leo asked for someone to check this. On the other hand, he regretted mentioning the girl in the report, but admitted he only promised to inform Prince Leonardo as soon as he learned something new. Meanwhile, in the tavern, Millie, helping to clear the table. She asked her father if he had heard about the recipe patenting system. Joe awkwardly admitted that yes, he really did it. The girl indignantly asked why he hadn't said so earlier, as it was a huge missed opportunity. Joe, slightly irritated, explained that both hiring and patent registration require contacting the trade guild, and they have certain difficulties with this, while the main character froze, asking what the matter was. Her father sighed heavily and explained that Marissa's grandfather was the head of the guild, but they once had a serious quarrel. And now they do not speak to each other. On the other side of the city, in the merchant guild building, an employee was finishing the monthly report on new pens, and the guild master dryly approved the completed work. Then the young man behind the counter cautiously added that recently rumors had been spreading in the city about a tavern called Shadow Cat, where the food had become strangely delicious. Previously, business here was extremely bad, but at that moment, a sharp crack sounded. The old count broke his pen in his hand. The frightened servant hurriedly stepped back and exclaimed that the report was ready. Left alone, the guild master sat in deadly silence, his face twisted with icy rage, his thoughts clear and merciless. He would never forgive the one who dared to steal his granddaughter. Millie asked embarrassedly, what does bad relations mean? And why did they quarrel so badly with the grandfather, the head of the guild? Joe looked seriously at his daughter. Then he turned away and briefly said that there were many reasons behind it. He gloomily added that he had no intention of contacting the trade guild, neither to hire nor to obtain a license. The main character, upset, tried to find out more, but Joe sharply cut off the conversation, saying that the topic was closed. Millie frowned and watched as her father walked away. After some time, the girl calmly swept the area near the entrance to the tavern. An unfamiliar man approached the door, and she politely smiled, informing him that the establishment was not yet open. The man sharply opened the door and, without looking at her, said that he was not a customer but had come on business to the owner. Millie called after him, but he ignored her and went straight to the bar. Joe stood with his back to the entrance and, without turning around, politely asked him to wait until opening, but the stranger disdainfully remarked that it was very noisy in the establishment right now. The girl's father turned around and looked at the guest questioningly. The man, crossing his arms over his chest, introduced himself. He was the owner of the neighboring Tavern. Both men sat at the table, and Millie brought the guest a drink, mentally noting that this was the owner. She cast a disapproving look at him. He didn't even say thank you. The girl frankly felt she did not like this man at all. Meanwhile, the guest said he had come with a request. Joe, subtly shielding his daughter, asked what exactly he wanted. The guest, without taking his eyes off the mug, said that the new dish had recently appeared on the menu of the Shady Cat Inn, or Katsu, if you remember correctly. He leaned back in the chair, put his hand under his head, and with a haughty nonchalance asked if they would give him the recipe, and Joe opened his eyes wide and stared at the guest. Clutching the fabric of his pants, he muttered that giving away the recipe was impossible. Ignoring his reaction, the guests turned away and, looking around the room, noticed that their tavern had finally come to life. And if you think about it, could this somehow be related to that new dish? He casually waved his hand toward Joe, and Millie grimaced with displeasure, inwardly outraged. But Joe frowned and said clearly that he could not give away the recipe for their most popular dish. The guest waved his hand dismissively, saying, "Don't dramatize, I didn't ask for it for free. You are offering a whole 3 copper coins." Millie looked at him angrily, remembering how much time, effort, and countless trials and errors they had spent perfecting this recipe. This strange man just appeared out of nowhere and demanded the recipe for a very popular dish into which they had put their heart and soul, and all for 3 copper coins, which she mentally converted into yen and indignantly thought it was only 3,000. She recalled Mr. Will's words, even the simplest recipe costs at least 5 copper coins. The main heroine clenched her fists and lowered her head, trying to hide the storm of emotions. She was about to start speaking, but Joe was first. He abruptly stood up from the table, looked the guest straight in the eyes, and with all seriousness said that he was not going to sell such a valuable recipe for nothing. This recipe was like a treasure to him. Millie looked at her father with admiration, Her eyes were wide open, and tears of pride and tenderness shimmered in them. The guest exclaimed, confused. His face twisted with anger, and he hit the table with his fist. Joe pushed the chair back and sternly said that if that was all, it was time for the guest to leave, because visitors would soon arrive and they needed to prepare. The main heroine proudly thought that her father had handled the situation perfectly. The owner of Mampo Kodai wanted to continue the argument, but the tavern doors swung open and the first guests appeared on the threshold. They greeted him and asked if they could come in. The man looked at him angrily, inwardly dissatisfied. He pushed them aside and went outside. The boy who was pushed rubbed his bruised shoulder and asked who it was. Joe immediately ran up to them with an awkward smile, apologized, and said that everything would be ready soon, offering them any free seats. Soon as always, the tavern filled with people. Making his way between the tables, Millie thought that in this world recipes were truly worth their weight in gold. One day she asked Marissa to take her to the market. In fact, the ingredients and spices were familiar to her from a past life. Only here, instead of the usual meat, they used monster meat. She had already gotten used to this. However, the culinary culture in this world was backward, and recipes mattered more to establishments than to ordinary people. That was why there was a whole system of patents. Looking at the Orc Katsu plate in her hands, the main heroine felt they simply had to protect this recipe. Later that evening, when there were no more customers, Millie called her parents, stood before them with a determined look, and announced that she was calling an urgent family meeting. The adults looked at her with surprise, but agreed to listen. The girl began on the agenda patenting recipes. She was convinced that the best thing was to go to the trade guild and officially register them. Joe sighed heavily and fell silent. Millie continued and asked if she understood correctly. After patenting a recipe, the payment for its purchase is made only once. Dad crossed his arms and explained that it was not quite so. If you buy a recipe for personal use, then yes, you pay once, but if you use it in business, you have to pay annually. That man thought it meant he wanted to get away with just 3 coppers, avoiding annual payments. She became even angrier and decided for herself that she would never forgive him for this. Suddenly it dawned on her. Imagine someone copied a recipe from a suspicious cat and patented it first, and now those who invented it will have to pay to use their own invention. She turned to her father and sincerely said that she completely agreed with him. The Orc Katsu recipe is their true treasure. She decisively said that no one has the right to steal the recipe into which she and her father had put so much soul and effort. Millie looked seriously at her parents, waiting for their reaction. Joe sighed deeply and repeated that yes, the recipe that Millie invented is their true treasure. He got up from the table and decisively said that it seemed they would have to gather courage and act. Marissa looked at her husband with tenderness and support. Millie literally shone from these words. Turning to his wife, Joe said that her grandfather once ordered him to stay away, but now it seemed they had no choice left. Marissa silently confirmed his words with a slight smile. Then the main character decided to ask again why they had completely broken off relations with her grandfather. Joe poured water into a mug. He began to tell that they had quarreled with all the relatives even before they bought this. They were cut off from Marissa's entire family, even from her grandfather, the former head of the trading house. At these words, Marissa and her husband lowered their eyes, their postures silently revealing sadness. His daughter, unable to calm down, bombarded him with questions. Joe freezes for a moment. Then Marissa quietly took his hand. She said that Millie deserved to know the whole truth. Joe nodded in agreement and admitted that he knew this conversation was bound to happen sooner or later. Then he looked up at Millie and said the most important thing: "You are my daughter, and I love you with all my heart." But they are not her biological parents. The main heroine froze. Joe, folding his hands on the table, continued and quietly said that they really had a biological daughter named Lisa, but she died when she was only a few months old. To not show their pain to others, they often came to her grave at night. It was there, in the cemetery, that they found the abandoned girl who would later possibly be named Millie. For Marissa's parents, this was the last straw. They refused to accept a child who was not theirs into the family, and Marissa and Joe could not come to terms with it. Millie silently processed what she had heard. She knew she was not their biological daughter and knew about Lisa, but she could not imagine that her adoptive parents would sever all ties with their family for her sake. Then Marissa spoke, folding her arms over her chest. She said with pain in her voice that this was exactly why they did not want to get involved with the trade guild. She did not want her blood relatives to say anything bad or hurt Millie. The girl, with eyes wide open in surprise, looked at her parents. She felt if her grandfather was against accepting her into the family, then he was unlikely to be kind to her. Perhaps that is why they were so heavily restricted. Without the guild's permission, they could neither hire people nor take on many orders. Then she looked at her parents. Their faces were filled with both admiration and worry for her, and Millie mentally apologized to them for causing them so much concern. The family she was born into in this world was terrible. She never considered those people her parents. From the very beginning, she knew they had taken her in, and then Millie smiled broadly and sincerely and thanked the adults for telling her everything. Maybe Marissa and Joe were not her biological parents, but to her, they were a real family. And she loved them very much. These words moved the adults' tears appeared in their eyes. At first, Millie did not notice their reaction and wanted to continue, but in a moment, both parents jumped up in their places and shouted her name. Hugging her from both sides, they began to cry, repeatedly saying how much they loved her. After some time, the adults calmed down a bit and stepped back, wiping their tears, and Marissa thanked the girl for accepting this difficult truth so calmly. Her daughter nodded affirmatively. She decisively declared it's decided. We will go and patent the recipe, and also asked the parents not to pay attention to possible objections from Grandpa. She promised that she herself would not do it either. Joe, captivated by her enthusiasm, immediately agreed to start as soon as possible. After all, Marissa was about to give birth and could not overexert herself. The tension of the moment suddenly dissipated. Marissa herself could not hold back and quietly giggled. Joe, looking at his daughter, said in surprise that she looked very serious and grown up. Could she really be only 5? Millie laughed briefly in response and thought to herself that she would definitely protect their family and shared recipes. Soon Million, or father, arrived at the building of the trade guild. Someone in the waiting hall is waiting to be called. The girl pressed against her father, silently supporting him with all her being. She raised her eyes and quietly asked if he was okay, and Joe, without looking at her and staring into the emptiness on the wall, briefly replied that he was. Recalling previous events at the family council, they finally decided to patent the recipes and senior employees through the guild, so today they came here early in the morning. The girl mentally noted that it was good she went with him. She had never seen Joe so tense and detached before. She decided to ask one more question. Was Marissa's grandfather really that terrible? Joe looked at her in surprise. Then he glanced again at the wall and said that he didn't particularly like it, although the reason was generally clear to him. Millie watched anxiously as her father clenched his hands tightly on his knees, trying to hold back. She wondered what her grandfather was like and whether he would humiliate them in front of everyone. Suddenly behind them it was loudly announced, visitors with number 3 to the reception. Millie instantly came to life, clenched her fists, and pulled her father out of his stupor, saying that they were being called and that he should wait. 2 entered the spacious office and sat at the large table. For several minutes the room was silent. Then one of the guild employees in uniform, with light hair combed back, entered the office. He held a folder with documents in his hands, apologized dryly for being late, sat opposite them, and explained that to patent the recipe, they first needed to fill out several documents, after which he handed Joe several sheets of paper. With a slight tone of contempt in his voice, he asked if Joe needed help filling them out. Joe, ignoring the tone, replied that everything was fine and he would manage on his own. The guild employee squinted slightly and said that for ordinary people, this rarely happens. Ordinary people, perhaps merchants, or from wealthy families, often don't even know how to read and write. Joe, like Marissa, had received a good education in this field. Then Millie, breaking free from her thoughts, looked at the clerk. She felt that he was unpleasant. Her intuition had not failed her last time. As soon as the papers were filled out, the guild employee took them and scanned the text, then muttered that he had heard for the first time about some suspicious kitty. He indifferently remarked that this was probably an establishment for ordinary people and was unlikely to be very profitable. Then he left the room, asked them to wait a bit. He would bring the prescription form and the contract. Millie watched him with a look full of disapproval. She had a bad feeling about this. Wow, how time flew. The main hero, increasingly irritated, thought that they were making him wait too long. Finally, the same employee returned to the room, apologized for the delay with a fake smile. He sat at the table, asked her to sign the contract, then give the prescription and handed the papers to Joe. He began to carefully study the documents, getting a bit lost in the lines and clearly tense. Millie tried to peek but barely saw anything. Looking at her father, she wondered if he even understood what was written there and whether she should check everything just in case. She was very disturbed by the self-satisfied expression on the employee's face. Finally deciding, she jumped onto her father's lap and tightly hugged his neck. He involuntarily caught her with one hand and asked in surprise what had happened. The main heroine, with a completely innocent look, looked at him and said she just wanted to review the contract while sitting next to him. Joe sighed heavily, seated her comfortably, closed his eyes for a moment, and agreed that they would look at it together. Ignoring his gentle strokes on her head, Millie began to read the text carefully. The first lines were familiar, but at the very bottom, in very small print, there was a note. The guild worker hurriedly said that the content of the contract should not cause them problems, and since there were many people in the morning, it was better to finish everything as soon as possible. Joe nodded in agreement, grabbed the pen, and was about to sign. Suddenly his daughter exclaimed, asking him to wait. She grabbed his hand, held it, and said that something was strange here. The clerk intervened and firmly told her not to interfere in her father's affairs. He suggested calling someone from behind the counter to watch over her, but Millie, ignoring him, picked up the contract and pointed to one clause, asking her father to look more closely. The document clearly stated, all recipes patented in the future would automatically fall under the terms of this agreement and remain there on a semi-permanent basis. Having read it carefully, Joe asked indignantly what that was supposed to mean, since it meant that the trade guild would take the lion's share of their future profits. Then he looked up at the man opposite and asked the same thing again. The man began to get nervous, laughed awkwardly, and said that this was how things were done in the trade guild, and the main agreement would appear later. As soon as this paper is signed, the prescription will be checked, and if there are no problems with the main contract, the deal will move forward. Millie frowned and looked at him intently. She thought he was clearly lying, his eyes darting everywhere. Could this man really be? The main character asked aloud, isn't their trade guild just a bunch of fraudsters? The employee froze in shock, tried to say something, but fell silent. He exclaimed indignantly, how dare she say such nonsense? Millie shouted back that it sounded very much like the truth. Aren't these the documents that were supposed to replace the main contract? The guild will insist that the contract itself will appear later, but they have already signed this sheet, so it is genuine. And suddenly it dawned on her. She asked if they planned to blackmail that suspicious cat later, demanding prescriptions and technologies. With each of her words, the workers' faces grew paler and more frightened. Millie got up from her father's lap, leaned her hands on the table, and continued, is it normal for such a share of the profit to go to the guild? Maybe this man invented his contract himself. And all the money would fly straight into his pocket. The guild employee frowned and tensely bowed his head over the table. And suddenly he jumped up from his seat and shouted that she was a little impudent girl. He grabbed Millie by the hair, saying that children have been very disobedient lately. Millie's eyes filled with tears from the pain, and she tried to pull the strand of hair from his hand. Joe instantly jumped up and loudly shouted his daughter's name. He hit the worker hard in the face, growling that he dared not touch his girl, hugged the child to himself, lifted her, and stroked her soothingly. The blow threw him against the wall. He hit his head, but not hard. Touching his cheek, he muttered that it hurt. He smiled and declared that since Joe had raised his hand against a guild worker, he was finished. Then he shouted loudly to the guards and ordered them to seize him. 2 guards instantly burst into the room. Pushing the girl out of her father's arms, they grabbed Joe, threw him to the floor, pinned him down, and sternly ordered him to behave decently. When the guild worker pointed at Millie and ordered them to seize her as well, strictly forbidding touching the documents on the table because now they were evidence. The girl became even more serious when she realized that the man wanted to destroy the evidence. She would never give up those papers. Summoning all her will, she mentally called upon the magic of the wind. The documents on the table quietly rose into the air and gently floated toward her. One of the guards noticed the strange movement of the documents in the air. Seeing the girl quickly hide them behind her back, he rudely asked what she was doing and ordered her to immediately hand over the papers. The guild worker shouted loudly, ordering the guards to quickly deal with the girl. The first guard immediately rushed to carry out the order. At that moment, still pressed to the floor, Joe began to struggle fiercely, shouting that they must not dare touch his daughter. The second guard barked at him, shut up, pulled out a baton, and swung it at the man's head. Jot collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Millie broke free from the first guard's hands and rushed to her father. She took his face in her hands, begged him to hold on, and just wanted to do something. But as soon as she withdrew her hands, she saw blood on them. Under the father's head, a dark puddle was already gathering and spreading. The main heroine turned pale with horror and could not take her eyes off that scene. Then the guild worker spoke again. Brushing his hair back, he said with icy arrogance that this is what happens to those who start writing. Then he again ordered to take the girl's documents. Millie slowly rose from her knees. Her gaze became empty and distant froze, staring out the window. Suddenly everything in the room shook. The floor and walls trembled, and a quiet hum sounded in the air. The guards froze in confusion, and the guild worker panicked and rushed to them. Joe came to his senses for a moment, weakly called his daughter's name, trying to stop her, but his strength left him, and his head fell back onto the floor. The main character froze his intention. Then she slowly turned to face them, her hands clenched into white fists. Her hair began to rise as if from an invisible wind. Her voice, low and full of icy anger, sounded in the ensuing silence, asking what they had done to her father. Suddenly, the whole room shook even more. The floor and walls trembled with new force. The windows rattled, deep cracks appeared in the ceiling and walls, and the sound of breaking boards and crumbling plaster was heard. In the room, the men began to suffocate, as if the air had become thick and heavy. One of the guards muttered heavily that his legs were not obeying. The guild worker Defly Pale leaned on the table, mumbling that he was about to lose consciousness. Millie stood motionless, her gaze cold and merciless fixed on the weakening opponents. At that moment, Joe came to his senses. His head was spinning, his thoughts confused, but instinct screamed. His daughter was in danger. With all his strength, he raised his head and saw her in the epicenter of chaos. Hoarsely, barely audibly, he pronounced her name and tried to crawl to her. Hearing her father's weak voice, Millie seemed to awaken from a deep sleep. Her eyes opened wide as she realized what was happening. The tension in the air instantly disappeared. Her hair fell onto her shoulders. She looked around in horror. The window frame was broken, the inkwell was overturned and ink spilled on the table, and the whole room was covered with a web of cracks. The guards and the scribe lay unconscious, and she stood alone on a small, untouched patch of floor, while the document she so fiercely protected lay calmly beside her. A terrible thought pierced her. Could she have done all this? It seems her rage unleashed magic, and it burst out, trying to protect her. Millie snapped out of the stupor and instantly rushed to her father, dropping to her knees beside him. In panic, she asked if he was all right. Millie pressed her lips together to keep from crying, looking at his terrible wound. She gently hugged him by the neck, trying not to cause him any more pain. At that moment, the door to the room suddenly opened, and several people appeared in the doorway. The main character looked at them with anxiety in his eyes. Enrique Rosetta, former head of the trading company Rosetta and current leader of the Eastern District Trade Guild, stepped forward, glanced at the ruined room with concern, and puzzled, asked what the noise was. His gaze slid over the shapeless bodies of the guild workers scattered on the floor, and he stammered, asking why they were all lying there. And what happened here? He looked closely at the people in the room. His attention was drawn to a familiar silhouette of a man to whom a girl was clinging. Enrique, he said distrustfully, is that Joe Spark lying there? Millie raised her eyes and looked at him. A thought struck her like lightning. Did this man know her father's name? So this must be the head of the trade guild who brought him to such a state. The girls' faces darkened, resolute and stern. She sharply threw it at the stuntman, who was probably the one behind this scam, and Enrique, puzzled, asked what she meant. Millie replied that she and Joe came here only to patent the recipes, but instead they encountered deception, and she angrily asked if he was the leader of this gang. He clearly understood nothing. Mr. Rosetta frowned and asked again for an explanation. In response, Millie shouted that they were all fraudsters, and that when she pointed out problems in the contract, they simply attacked her and her father. Enrique sharply stepped forward, exclaimed that this was nonsense, and asked if she had any evidence, and the main heroine firmly nodded and replied that she did. She picked up a sheet of paper from the floor, which she had been desperately protecting, showed it to the guild master, and said that this was exactly the contract given to them by the employee. She added that the man could only look at it, but since it was important evidence, he must not touch it. Mr. Rosetta approached the girl, bent down, thoughtfully reading the contract and stroking his beard. Reaching the end of the text, he came across the clause that had earlier confused Millie and caused this whole unpleasant situation. His eyes widened in shock. He straightened up, clenched his fists in anger, cleared his throat, and said that he understood everything, adding that he would like to hear the details, but first they needed to treat Joe's wounds. Enrique reached out to the injured man, but the girl noticed the movement and looked displeased and worried. When she jumped up and stood between them, spreading her arms, she shouted for them not to even dare to touch her father. Millie frowned, and a tear still stood in her eyes from fear for her father. The man straightened up, stepped back a step, and said displeased that she was the adopted daughter of his granddaughter. Mr. Rosetta sighed deeply, turned around and asked Millie to calm down, promising that he would send people he trusted to take Joe to the medical station and provide him with help. Then he reached out his hand to the girl and asked her to go with him. He asked if she wanted to stay in this ruined room. Soon in the guild master's office, Millie settled on the sofa and told her great-great-great-grandfather what had happened. He sat opposite in a chair and listened attentively, and she, folding her hands on her knees, asked if the guild would punish those who tried to deceive her and her father. Enrique frowned and sighed deeply. He asked her name and, after waiting for a nod, said that she was right, and Mr. Rosetta noted that with such a contract these people could indeed be called fraudsters, and there would be no objections. He added that it seemed the employee who received them secretly forged the contract, and the guild did not even suspect it, and had already ordered to check all other documents that the employee had dealt with. Then he sincerely regretted that the guild employee resorted to violence against Joe Spark. He lowered his head. Millie was silent, frozen with surprise. She thought that as the head of the guild, who turned a blind eye to the intrigues of subordinates, Enrique surely had to apologize, but he not only formally admitted the mistake, he sincerely apologized for the actions of his subordinates and immediately took care of Joe's treatment. Although, as is known, he did not like him very much, and the girl mentally noted that her grandfather was indeed a good person. The main heroine tensed inside and realized that she had to calm down. She had lost her temper a little earlier, so now she would have to speak calmly. Riquet straightened up and said that he somehow wanted to make it right before her and Joe. Millie waved her hand, saying that there was no need to apologize, and then somewhat awkwardly asked if they could quietly clean up the wrecked room. The man slightly tilted his head and asked what had happened to the room. The main heroine awkwardly muttered that her magic seemed to have gotten out of control. She explained that when she saw her father wounded, she lost control of herself. Then Millie lowered her head and sincerely apologized. She continued that this deception, of course, stunned her. But she herself, without even noticing it, unintentionally destroyed the room. The girl thoughtfully looked at her hands. She raised her head, smiled warmly, and asked if this should not be considered mutual harm. Mr. Rosetta looked at her in surprise and muttered that such a result would definitely benefit the guild. But then he asked much more seriously, has children's magic really gotten out of control, and how powerful was it anyway? The main heroine smiled back friendly and conspiratorially, raised her index finger to her lips, and whispered that it was a secret. The old man only looked at her in surprise. He pressed hard against Rika's side again, nodded, and said he would ask his trusted people to restore the room to its previous appearance. She just froze for a few seconds, depressed, recalling what had happened earlier. She thought anyone could believe it was anger that unleashed her magic, and now she had to be much more careful. Then the main heroine looked up at the guild leader, who had just risen from the table, and stumbling, asked what would happen to those she had stunned. Mr. Rosetta carelessly said that they would soon come to their senses. Millie lit up from this news. The man did not calm down and added, it is fair to say that those people are to blame for everything. He also promised that he would not tell anyone about her magic. The girl nodded happily in agreement and thanked him. The man said that they would keep all this fraud inside the guild, in secret. Millie intervened and smiled, noting that this all sounded very much like a deal. RK turned to the girl and indignantly asked if she was really a normal child. He crossed his arms over his chest and, noticeably displeased, said that she had spoken like an adult from the very beginning. Suddenly, there was a knock on the office door. An attractive young man, one of the guild workers, quietly peeked into the room. Apologetically smiling for interrupting the conversation, he announced that Marissa's spark had arrived and explained that she had come for the daughter because she had been absent for too long. Then Marissa herself entered the room, neatly folded her hands in front of her, gently smiled at Enrique, said that they had not seen each other for a long time, called him grandfather, and asked how he was doing. The man looked at the guest and literally lit up for a moment, exclaiming her name. Millie watched in fascination as the scene unfolded and turned into a wild wasteland. Rikai instantly rushed to the girl, anxiously asking if she was okay, since long trips could be very hard on her condition. The man asked in surprise if she had come here on foot. Marissa laughed and replied that she had hitchhiked. The man became even more worried, saying that it must have been cramped and uncomfortable there, so why did she take such a risk? And what if something happened to her? Millie watched this scene with admiration and thought that if Reich had a tail, he would definitely wag it happily from side to side. And then she wondered, did he really love Marissa? The man continued to insist that he would arrange a separate carriage for the return trip, to which Marissa gratefully agreed. Millie remembered how at the family council they talked about her grandfather, and everyone believed that he cursed their family with the worst words. Now everything became clear. He disliked Joe so much because he was the husband of his favorite granddaughter. She thought that maybe he was just a grandfather who adored his granddaughter, but the sudden thought that he might be spying on her sent a chill down her spine. After all, how could he have found out about her pregnancy? In a moment the three finally sat down to have tea. Marissa firmly hugged Millie by the shoulders, and Enrique sat opposite, beaming with happiness. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. The guild leader allowed the visitor to enter. Joe entered the room with a bandage on his head, and Marissa and her daughter, seeing him, rushed to him. They anxiously asked if he was okay. He awkwardly rubbed his head and said that now everything was fine. The girl said she was very worried about him. Rikai stood up, bowed his head, and apologized to Joe for what happened, adding that as the head of the trade guild, he offered his deepest apologies. Joe turned to him, hugged his wife by the shoulders, tousled his daughter's hair, and said that of course he was very angry, but fortunately nothing happened to Millie. Then he sincerely thanked him for the treatment. Mr. Rosetta added that he would like to properly apologize later, and that, if possible, when everything settles down, they could come and dig into the recipes as they wanted. He sincerely apologized. Millie was delighted. It seemed their main goal to patent the recipes would be achieved, and she realized that her son-to-year grandfather, whom she feared so much, was actually not so scary at all. And Shadikit could also benefit from establishing good relations with the trade guild. A little later, they were all standing on the street, preparing to set off. Marissa waved goodbye to her grandfather. Joe helped her get into the carriage. When Millie started to follow, Ricky suddenly remembered something and asked her to wait a minute. He handed her a cookie, carefully wrapped in a handkerchief, and quietly said that although it was not a full snack, he asked her to take them with her. The main heroine lit up and looked enchanted at the treat, thinking that for the first time in her life, she was seeing truly ordinary sweets. She took one cookie, bit into it, and quietly moaned with pleasure. It was so sweet and rich, as if not a single penny was spared in its preparation, simply perfect. Joe called her with a sly smile, asked her to come down from the clouds to earth, and noted that since it was such an expensive treat, it was worth savoring. Millie closed her eyes, thanked her grandfather, and said that now they were reconciled. The man froze for a moment in shock, repeating in his mind that she called him grandfather. He turned away, blushed, and said that they would see each other soon anyway. He asked her to be careful on the way home. Soon Enrique was already standing in his office. He sighed deeply. His dear granddaughter had left again. About the girl Millie, about how she was the one and only. He had never heard of such uncontrolled magic release with such destructive consequences, and anxiously wondered how much power was hidden in her. But if his beloved Marissa was happy, he could sigh with relief. He was not at all against them taking an adopted daughter, but Marissa's parents were categorically against it, and because of this he could not see her for a long time. How happy he was when after so many years he finally saw her face. But he still could not stand her husband, Joe Spark. Behind there was a slight rustle. Enrique, without turning, asked if Gecko had moved. He heard a quiet confirmation. He turned around and looked at the subordinate in a mask and cloak, asking if he knew that his great-great-granddaughter had so much magical power. Find him a mother he never had. He looked at her only as a usual tavern guest and did not even suspect that she had such power. And again shoved it into the jar and then ordered to clean the damaged room over the next few days. Gecko added that there was something else. He was the one who arranged Marissa's arrival to the guild. He believed it was time for his master to finally meet his granddaughter. Master Rosetta waved it off. It doesn't matter, thanks to him. He saw Marissa for the first time in a long while. Then he ordered to continue reporting on Shadowcat Inn. He noticed that Millie was like a bomb about to explode, and she needed to be kept under close watch. Several days passed after the incident at the Trade Guild. Millie and her father returned to pat the recipes. They settled on the sofa and placed several dishes before them, and Enrique Rosetta, sitting in the chair opposite, explained that for the patents to become official, he needed to taste everything. Millie agreed, nodded decisively, and invited him to start. The man speared a piece of Orc Katsu with a fork, bit it off, and looked at the dish with surprise, mumbling that it was very tasty. Such recipes would definitely sell out, especially this cutlet, which turned out to be incredibly delicious. Millie raised her finger and glanced at her father, mentally noting that her grandfather praised the signature dish of their tavern very much. RK sincerely and surprisedly asked if the girl really came up with all of this herself. The next moment he put down the fork, placed his hands on his hips, and said that releasing such a bunch of new recipes at once could attract unwanted attention. So that the envious would not guess where that restaurant was. It would be better to quietly issue the recipes under a different name, creating a new trading company for this purpose, that is, to arrange a cover. Millie thought for a few seconds. Fortunately, Shady Cat became famous for its delicious food, and rumors about it were already spreading among adventurers of the Eastern District. Aristocrats did not look into their part of the city, so it was still too early to worry about recipe theft. But she thought with displeasure that if many such tricksters from Mancuputia appeared, it would be a real nightmare. Joe listened carefully and added that if that suspicious cat unofficially bought these patents from the new company, then everything would be fine. They would patent the recipes under a different name, and the issue of possible theft would disappear. When they considered all the options, Joe turned to his daughter and said, "Since you are the creator of the recipes, come up with a name for the new company." The character pondered for a few seconds. The name had to be tasteful, because he was deliberately disguised, and it had to be witty and in no way related to that suspicious cat. The next moment, it suddenly occurred to her. She said that the trading company would be called Paper Mannequin, and asked the adults what they thought about this idea. RK thoughtfully stroked his beard and asked again to clarify what exactly that meant. Millie froze in confusion, realizing that explaining would be difficult because it was a play on words. Paper Shell Company meant a fictitious company that existed only on paper. She just smiled and said that she simply liked how the name sounded, and Enrique shrugged. If she liked it, so be it. The main heroine decided that this name was perfect, and she really liked it. And so the temporary pseudonym was born Shadowcat, a company that trades paper dolls. Soon the three of them settled back into their seats and drank tea. Suddenly Enrique cleared his throat and asked Joe how Marissa was doing. Joe, recalling recent events, was a bit embarrassed and said that thanks to Mr. Roasty she felt good. Her belly was already quite big, and the baby had even kicked recently. At these words, the old man literally beamed, imagining the scene. You notice how sad the older man has become. Millie sighed heavily in surprise and asked why he simply didn't visit them if he was feeling lonely. Joe grumbled that there was no need to complicate things. Enrique was choking on his tea and exclaimed, "What kind of influence is this?" Then added quietly that he could hear everything. The main heroine laughed awkwardly and apologized she didn't think he would hear. It turned out the man had excellent hearing. Joe frowned and asked his daughter not to tease Grandpa. Enrique exclaimed irritably, "Joe, don't you dare call me Grandpa." Joe, however, paid no attention to this. He was thinking aloud that, until Marissa gives birth, he needs to find new workers and promote the tavern. Mr. Rosetta laughed thoughtfully and said that on the way back it would be worth stopping by the guild bulletin board. Millie intervened and decisively declared that since this is for Mom, Grandpa must do everything he can. Hearing these words, Enrique frowned sternly. He promised that for Risa's sake he would find the best people he could, and he could be relied upon, and Millie gratefully thanked him and thought to herself that her son, the future Grandpa, was strangely simple-hearted. Soon Grandpa escorted Millie and her father to the exit. Joe had to stay at the reception, so he asked his daughter to wait near the entrance and promised he would return quickly. The main heroine nodded in agreement. And then Rikai approached her. He called her. He exclaimed that her magical power was a real bomb and asked if she had already passed the mandatory test. The girl asked confusedly, what was that? RK explained that Joe told her, as soon as you turn 5 years old, everyone must undergo a magic test in the church. This test measures how much magic is in you and determines which magical element you will be able to control. Such tests are held regularly there. He also added that one of these tests will take place next month, and she will definitely be taken there, right? Millie froze thoughtfully when she heard these words. Then her grandfather advised her once again to be careful. At that moment Joe approached, rubbing his head, and awkwardly said that they could go apologize for the delay mentioned in the agreement. Finally, he wished him a safe journey. Millie waved her hand in farewell in response. Joe extended his hand to his daughter and said it was time to go home. The main heroine grabbed his hand with a broad smile. And she froze thoughtfully. She recalled her great-grandfather's warning. He was worried if her magic, due to its immense power, attracted attention. She, a commoner, could easily be deprived of this power, and in the future this could become a serious problem. After considering this, Millie decided that she probably really shouldn't get involved in church affairs, but she absolutely did not want to part with Marissa and Joe. At home, the main hero sat heavily in the room and pondered the situation. She waves her hand, and sparks of all the main elements flare up in the air. She smiled smugly, mentally ordering that one to send her grandfather, as if she really controlled everything. After all, she trained secretly every day to increase her reserves. As a result, she could now simultaneously create 100 small lights. Recently, she even learned to create a large, stable sphere of light. It turned out that magic in this world was divided. Life magic, pure light, classical elemental magic, water, earth, wind, and fire. There was also white and black magic, and in addition, rare regional elements were encountered. Millie remembered how, looking at the wounded Joe, she desperately wished to be able to use white healing magic. After that event, she secretly began practicing both white and black magic, and recalled how once she tried to heal a wounded cat with a healing spell. She also separately practiced black magic, carefully experimenting with a darkness spell. But this magic took an incredible amount of strength. The girl learned this from her own bitter experience. Magic was primarily an image, perhaps some kind of bonus after rebirth, but all the elements of Bader, Millie's mana reserves, were replenished daily, and the set of magic available to her expanded. But, sighing heavily, she thought that she would probably have to undergo this trial in the church after all. She somehow hid the elements, showing only one. But the main problem was the amount of mana. If this continued, she would surely be exposed. The main heroine thought with displeasure that, according to her great-grandfather, if her true power was revealed, she could be forcibly taken or even kidnapped, and this was exactly what she least wanted. Just the thought of her sent a chill down her spine. Millie did not want to part from her parents, so she had to continue developing the suspicious cat. Sighing deeply once again, she decided. And soon the day of the exam came. Nina and her mother came to the tavern. The girl smiled happily and said she had come from Illy. Meanwhile, Marissa smiled warmly at the woman and asked her to look after her daughter, and the woman gently responded with a smile, nodded, and reassured Marissa, asking her not to worry and to relax. Meanwhile, the main heroine went downstairs and apologized for being late. Nina wanted to greet her, but instead gasped in fright. The women also turned around and looked at the girl in horror. She looked incredibly exhausted, with deep dark circles under her eyes, as if she had not slept for several nights in a row. A little later, Millie, Nina, and her mother were riding by carriage to the church for the trial, and Nina said excitedly that it was all so thrilling. Her family had run an oil mill for centuries, so most likely she would discover the element of fire. Then she turned to her friend and asked what magic she wanted. Millie thought for a few seconds, strangely closing her eyes, afraid to reveal that she knew much more about magic than was appropriate for her age, and then answered that she would like the element of water because it was so interesting. She laughed awkwardly, and Nina just looked at her embarrassed. Millie anxiously thought that Joe could not tear himself away from work at the suspicious tavern Shady Cat Inn, because it was already lunchtime, and Marissa, being pregnant, had to avoid extra stress and rest well, so she was going to the magic test together with Nina and her mother. Since early morning, her parents had done everything to lift her spirits, wished her luck, and constantly said that she would definitely succeed. Meanwhile, the heroine had only one thought: under no circumstances reveal her true magical power. So her plan had to work. A sharp jolt on a particularly bumpy section of the road snapped her out of deep thoughts. Millie turned pale and started feeling nauseous. Nina sympathetically remarked that today's trip was especially hard, but Millie did not respond, only thought heavily that she was so tired she didn't even have the strength to speak. Before their departure, she had been constantly using light magic, probably summoning hundreds of small spheres, so her magical reserves had significantly depleted. Nina groaned. She was also feeling unwell. Meanwhile, they approached the church and stopped. The main heroine looked admiringly at the majestic building before her, thinking that the trial would take place here both for common people and aristocrats, and the difference in their status was immediately noticeable, so she remarked aloud that there was still time before their turn. She turned to her friend, saw her pale face, and called her anxiously. Nina mumbled that she felt nauseous, then surprisingly noted that in the morning Millie could barely stand on her feet, but now looked much cheerier. The main heroine awkwardly laughed and replied that she had just dozed off in the carriage because she couldn't admit that she was staggering due to deliberately exhausting her magical energy. They entered the waiting hall, and Millie felt that something was wrong. Her magical power seemed to be replenishing by itself, so she needed to use some magic right before the test. She got up from the bench, told her restored friend that she was quickly running to the restroom, and received a nod in response. Looking around admiringly, she was walking somewhere and only later realized that she was lost. In one of the spacious abandoned halls, she stopped, impressed by a series of majestic statues. She became curious about what these sculptures were: divine figures, possibly even gods of this world. And at the very edge stood a statue of some kind of beastman. She muttered aloud that something was growing out of the head of one of the statues. A strangely calm voice took over for her and explained that it was a horn and that she was looking at 5 divine beasts, servants of the gods. The voice also noted, from her expression it was clear she probably took them for beastmen. Millie turned to the stranger and was about to say that he seemed to know his business well. But at these words she froze in surprise. In front of her stood a tall young man with light, almost golden hair and noble features. Elegant but strict clothing revealed him as a clergyman of very high rank, and his entire figure radiated incredible nobility. Millie suddenly remembered Joe's words: among the aristocracy there are plenty of blondes. The girl glanced at the statues and mentally noted that the stranger really had very beautiful golden hair. This man was clearly an aristocrat. The man smiled and, to satisfy her curiosity, told her that in the center stood the statue of the creator goddess. To the left, the harvest goddess Crisia with a wreath on her head and a branch in her hands, and the god of peace Bolti, the one with the horn and wolf face. To the right, the goddess of love Mavetta and the god of war Vane in armor with weapons, and Millie listened with fascination. She turned to the priest and sincerely thanked him for the story. When he asked her why she was here, she explained that she had come for a magical trial. He saw her smile so painfully familiar that he froze in surprise. He slightly extended his hand and whispered the name Marianne embarrassedly. He froze in this movement, as if immersed in memories. The main character looked at him in surprise and awkwardly muttered that it was not Marianne. The priest hurriedly apologized and was about to add something when a child's cry interrupted him from behind. Nina ran up to them and, slightly out of breath, exclaimed that she had been looking for her friend everywhere. She appeared and it was their turn. The main heroine apologized to the man, said she understood everything, and rushed after her friend. The priest called her, asked her to wait. He asked again if he had heard correctly that her name was Millie. She turned around as she was leaving and said that Millie was a nickname, and her real name was Miriana Spark. Nina, walking ahead, shouted for them to hurry. They needed to rush. Millie nodded. She disappeared through the door, leaving the priest standing with his outstretched hand and completely confused. Soon they ran into the hall for the test. When it was the main heroine's turn, she reached for the magic ball and, hearing about the week of evaluation, raised her fist in a gesture of victory to herself. The priest conducting the ritual said that the element determination takes place in another hall and asked her to go there. Millie, happily humming to herself, thought that it was worth spending all the magic until the very last moment. In the yard where the element determination was supposed to take place, there were many children. The priest conducting the ceremony waved his hand and called everyone to him. Millie turned around and thought confusedly that with such a crowd here, calming so many 5-year-olds was no easy task, so she decided to get out of here as quickly as possible. The priest began to explain the method of element determination, but the main character was no longer listening. He focused only on showing one of the 4 main elements. She sighed deeply and gathered her thoughts. She stretched out her hands and, smiling sincerely, loudly shouted the spell water. Between her palms, a bubble instantly appeared, rapidly inflating to the size of a ball. Millie, watching this, felt that this demonstration was quite enough. She lowered her hands and looked at the priest. He froze, stunned by her magic and shock. The girl got a little nervous, approached him, and asked if everything was all right. The priest blushed, hesitated, glanced at the sheet, and finally said that, judging by her reaction, her element was water. The main heroine mentally noted that Joe's element was fire, and Marissa's was wind, so she chose water, which could be useful to both. Finally, the priest handed her a paper with the conclusion about her magic, and the girl happily sang to herself that it was finally over, only left to tell her parents, which meant now she could openly use water magic in front of them. Humming a melody, she raised her fist in a sign of victory and thought that everything was going wonderfully. At sunset, Millie returned home. Stepping over the threshold, she grumbled how tired she was after the day. Her parents immediately approached her, and Marissa greeted her at home. They asked how the test went. The girl approached and quietly replied that her magical power was weak and her element was determined to be water. Her mother slightly bowed her head and smiled. She shyly muttered that it was a pity it was not fire, but on the other hand, she was glad that her daughter did not have such magical power, otherwise it would be dangerous. Joe folded his arms on his chest, smiled at his daughter, and asked why she was smiling. She smugly thought how wrong they were after all. She could control all the elements. Suddenly, Mill held her breath and, creating a water bubble between her palms, like in the test, asked her parents to look at how well she was doing. They froze for a few seconds, not understanding what was happening. Marissa, full of admiration, asked with interest if she could already use magic, and Joe immediately agreed, once again confirming that their daughter was a little genius. The main heroine thought that her mission was accomplished. Meanwhile, while happiness reigned in the shadowy cat tavern, in the church after all the checks were completed, there was a completely different atmosphere. In one of the offices, the same high-ranking priest stood thoughtfully by the window, thinking about how many years had passed, probably about 5, and then quietly groaned, wondering why he was left alone in this world. Before coming to the church, he was an assistant to His Majesty Leonardo, the premier, and worked in the palace. Time had never dragged so slowly before. Every day then was bustling with activity, but he was happy, and with these thoughts he closed his eyes. The image of that girl was etched into his memory forever, like a frozen frame. He could not even imagine that such a future awaited him. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. The priest who conducted the assessment of elemental abilities of 5-year-old children entered. He apologized for entering without permission. Then he approached the senior priest with a pile of papers in his hands and reported that today's magical test was completed, and he brought the results. The chief priest nodded and thanked him for his diligent work. The subordinate continued, spreading out sheets with the results on the table, and said that, as expected, the children of aristocrats have considerable magical power, but today during the elemental check of the travelers, he noticed something strange. The high priest tilted his head with a curious look, as if asking for an explanation. Recalling the events of the day, the subordinate said that he had not even begun to explain the movement of magical power when suddenly one boy, a commoner, used water magic. The senior priest's eyes widened in surprise, and he asked if the child could really use magic immediately, without any explanations. The junior priest muttered that this had never happened before, and maybe he was mistaken. There are so many children today. But the chief priest did not listen to explanations and immediately asked where the data about the child was. The second priest slid him the necessary sheet with the results. The boss's eyes again widened in surprise when he read a familiar name, Mariana Spark. He froze for a few seconds. He could not believe it was just a coincidence. Could this be the same girl he had seen earlier in the hall with statues? Carefully reading the paper, he muttered her surname, then aloud asked the subordinate if she was not a relative of Baron Edler, the owner of magical artifacts, and immediately corrected himself. If she were from that family, she would have already registered in the hall for aristocrats. It occurred to him, maybe she deliberately passed the check as a commoner to hide her connections with the aristocracy. The junior priest with a trembling voice asked if everything was all right. Then, answering, he apologized and said he did not know the details of her origin. The chief priest turned to the window and told him not to worry, adding that he would keep the information about the girls for some time. Lost in thought, he could not understand why exactly today. Suddenly he remembered that day, and before his eyes appeared the image of the girl, his dear Marianne. Millie was so much like her. Looking into the abyss behind the glass, he whispered confusedly, "Who is this girl really?" Winter came to Shadowcat Inn, and finally the long-awaited day arrived. Millie, standing next to Marissa, who was breathing heavily from pain, shouted that Marissa was starting to give birth. Mother asked her again, barely audibly. Meanwhile, Joe ran into the room in ordinary clothes and quickly apologized, saying he had stopped by the midwife next door, but she was not there. This news terribly frightened Marissa Turnpill. Millie, who was anxiously waiting with her father, quietly whispered that the baby was about to be born. The door burst open again. A breathless adult woman ran into the room. The midwife rushed after her, taking off her outerwear on the go, apologizing and explaining that she had just returned from the neighboring town. After catching her breath a little, she said that now everything should be left to her. Joe and Millie exchanged glances, sighed with relief, and thanked her. The man muttered that everything would be fine, and suddenly turned pale, collapsed to the floor. The girl screamed in fear. The midwife waved her hand, reassured that everything was fine now, and asked Millie to hug her father. He needed it right now. Millie nodded decisively, placed a pillow under his head, covered him with a blanket, and sat down next to him. Joe got up, groaning from the heaviness in his head. As soon as he came to, he immediately shouted his wife's name, looking around in panic and trying to understand where she was and if everything was okay. The midwife sighed and smiled nearby, noticing that the man had finally woken up. She moved aside a little to clear the view and said that they had a healthy boy and that both the baby and the mother were feeling well. Joe finally saw his complete family. Millie was standing by the bed. Marissa was sitting, leaning against the headboard, smiling at her husband and holding their tiny, quietly crying son in her arms. The girl approached her father, took his hand, and sincerely congratulated him on the birth of his son. At first, Marissa's eyes filled with tears. Benjo himself had tears glistening in his eyes. The father rushed to the bed, picking up his daughter on the way and tightly hugging her, his wife and son, shouting through tears that he was infinitely happy. He carefully took the baby in his arms and said that his wife was a true heroine. Marissa, gently wiping her tears, whispered words of gratitude and added that she was also thankful to Millie. Joe sat on the edge of the bed next to his wife and asked the little girl if she wanted to hold her little brother. Millie immediately stretched out her hands and joyfully exclaimed, "Of course I want to." Then she froze for a moment, as if she remembered something. She asked him to wait, turned away, and a little panicked, read a cleansing spell for hands and clothes several times, while the father nervously laughed and asked her not to use magic indiscriminately. The main heroine did not listen to him and again stretched out her carefully washed hands, took the baby, and diligently supported his head, as she was advised. With a gentle, infinitely happy smile, she looked at the boy, and he responded with a toothless smile, clenching his tiny palms into fists and closing his eyes. Lily's eyes widened, and she thought with admiration that this boy was a true angel. The parents tenderly watched this scene for several minutes. The midwife, whom everyone had already forgotten, had already packed her things and dressed, stood in the doorway and said that she could probably leave. Joe ran up to her and hurriedly but sincerely thanked her, explaining that he had asked the neighbors, but the midwife was nowhere to be found, and immediately offered to pay her for the help. The old woman bowed her head with a gentle smile and said that she had already been paid. To the family's obvious surprise, she explained that Enrique Rosetta had woken her up and insisted that she come, which surprised her very much. For a moment, Millie thought that her grandfather might have been involved in this, but she immediately corrected herself. The main thing was that he had not gone too far. She quietly thanked him for the help. When the midwife left, the whole family gathered around the cradle, where the boy was peacefully sleeping, and spoke quietly, when suddenly Joe remembered that they had not yet chosen a name for him and asked what they would call him. Then he suggested Zyak. Marissa repeated the name, combining it with their surname, and said that it was beautiful and strong, and Millie happily nodded in agreement. Suddenly she remembered how her adoptive parents once chose her name with the same enthusiasm, how touching and full of nostalgia it was. Looking at Marissa and Joe shining with happiness, who had been smiling all morning, and at her younger brother. Her eyes sparkled with joy. She thought, today in this world, she officially became an older sister. Several weeks had passed since he was born again. Millie was sitting on the sofa in her grandfather's office in the Trade Guild of the Eastern District and thanked him wholeheartedly for his timely help. Then with a slight smile, noted that he seemed to be on good terms with that midwife, and Rikai laughed and replied that that woman really helped him a lot. Today, the main heroine came to patent the recipe for stuffed cabbage rolls she had just invented. Joe was not nearby. He was in the kitchen preparing a trial portion of the dish. Rikai suddenly became nervous and started bombarding the girl with questions. How was Marissa? How did the delivery go? Was she okay? He also added that a few days ago he had gathered everything he considered necessary and sent it to them. Remembering how many chests and boxes at home were stuffed with clothes and toys for Zik, Millie thanked her grandfather aloud and said that for now they had everything they needed, and thought to herself that this was starting to look like some kind of obsession with his grandson. She thanked him again and smiled, adding that if he wanted, he could come to them himself. It would make everyone incredibly happy. And at Reikei, he just waved his hand and said that if he publicly recognized Marissa and Joe's marriage, it would cause a lot of problems. Millie froze gloomily at these words, not even taking a sip of tea. With a slight hint of threat in her voice, she said that her mother had been married for a long time. Moreover, if his charming great-grandson heard such words, he would definitely cry. The man instantly shuddered at the thought. The main heroine quickly changed the subject. She jumped up, twirled around to show off her new dress, and thanked her grandfather for it and for the cookies. Then she said she wanted to ask him one more thing. She pulled out from under her collar on a string a decoration resembling an elegant shell, and asked what it was because it was clearly not just a necklace, but the very same thing that lay in that very wooden box. And a second later Rikei exclaimed, "Did she break that box?" Millie indignantly replied no. She thoughtfully explained that it was a puzzle box and very difficult to open, recalling how much time she had spent on it. The guild leader, folding his arms across his chest and puffing his cheeks angrily, asked if she really opened it, then snorted and admitted he thought she wouldn't manage and would run to ask him for help, and Millie gloomily thought that it was like kindergarten. Meanwhile, Reikei explained that this necklace was a magical artifact. As soon as the owner was threatened by danger, it raised a protective barrier around them, and inside was hidden a magical stone. Millie looked at the artifact with a spark in her eyes and murmured that she had never seen anything like it before. Rikai added that the stone was protected by a shell made in the likeness of the very same shell that saved the divine bolt beast when it fell from the heavens. The main heroine said that now she understood. Suddenly, she noticed that the merchant guild held the very same thing, a talisman. Rikai again caught her attention and explained that he gave her this artifact in case her power went out of control again. Her magic was dangerous. It radiated cold fear. And if it broke free, it could hurt the girl herself. So she will have to wear this necklace. Millie looked at her grandfather in surprise. She thanked him joyfully, jumped closer, and hugged him tightly. She promised to take good care of the gift, and Rikane nodded slightly, a bit embarrassed. Grandfather turned back to his great-granddaughter and saw that the room had been quietly and neatly cleaned. Millie froze, recalling their unspoken agreement. In exchange for them hiding her fraud in the Guild of Secrets, she asked to clean the room she had trashed and not to reveal the truth about her real magic. Then Rik added that the employee who forged the contract was handed over to the knights for fraud. But that was not all. Besides Millie, there were other victims. The Trade Guild will pay compensation to all of them. The girls sat back on the sofa and smiled happily, saying that this was good news. She happily hummed, saying that all this meant the incident was resolved and no one was seriously hurt. Enrique looked at her reservedly, put his hand to his forehead, and said that she was still just a child, then sighed and muttered that it did not matter. Suddenly, the head's assistant knocked on the door, apologizing for the interruption. He informed that the head of Azure Trading Company urgently requested a meeting. Enrique sighed deeply, said through his teeth that there was nothing he could do, and asked his subordinate to escort the guest to the reception room. Approaching the door, he remembered his great-granddaughter, turned to her and said sternly that he would be out for a short time, and she should wait in the room, not touching anything, and to emphasize, he wagged his index finger. Millie looked at him tensely and, forcedly smiling, raised her thumb as if promising to follow his instructions. Enrique looked embarrassed at this strange gesture and asked what it meant, but the girl only laughed awkwardly and did not answer. Left alone, Millie after some time began talking to herself, grumbling that grandfather told her to wait. But she was bored and she had already eaten all the cookies. Suddenly an idea flashed through her mind. Grandfather said not to touch anything, but she could walk around. She jumped off the sofa. She slowly wandered around the office and stopped by one of the walls, where she noticed many paintings and maps and opened her curiosity, what was depicted on them. The main heroine decisively nodded to herself, and summoning the magic of the wind, gently rose into the air. She quietly exclaimed with joy, she did it. Now she could at least see what was hanging above. Huge, detailed map of the Kingdom of Datoria with the capital especially caught her eye. The capital was divided into 4 districts. In the north lived the aristocracy, in the east craftsmen and wealthy townspeople, in the center large hospitals and trading companies with a medicinal herb garden, and in the south stretched the factory quarter of common people. Looking at the map, Millie tried to find her home, the tavern Cat's Shadow, and the building of the trade guild where she was now. She shifted her gaze to the neighboring map. It turned out to be the second largest city after the capital, the port city of Azur, and the girl's face lit up at the thought that there would surely be many seafood dishes there. Next, her gaze fell on the next painting, a portrait of the king of this country. Looking closely, Millie froze. He seemed to remind her of someone, but she could not remember who exactly. Suddenly, voices were heard behind the door. Someone was approaching, and one of them was already thanking the guild leader for accepting him, even though he appeared unexpectedly. The guild leader replied that he was always happy to help, and the footsteps quietly faded as they approached the office. Meanwhile, the main character gently landed near the table and threw herself back onto the sofa. When Rakai entered the room, she was already sitting there, with the most innocent expression on her face and calmly sipping tea from a mug. She greeted her grandfather with a gentle smile and said that she missed him. Rakai did not believe that performance for a minute. He noticed that something strange was constantly happening around his great-great-granddaughter and asked if she really just sat there all the time, and Millie nodded several times and said that she was an obedient child. After some time, there was a knock at the door. Joe entered and, addressing his daughter, said it was time to go, then asked how long she had been waiting. Millie took the hat from the table, put it on, and said goodbye to the guildmaster. He nodded, wished her a safe journey, and asked her to take care of Marissa. Any frown barely noticeable, and he quietly added that the outfit suited her very well. The main heroine grabbed the brim of the hat and, smiling broadly, exclaimed that it was a gift from Grandpa and it couldn't be otherwise. The man turned away in embarrassment, and Millie thought that her grandfather was such a typical Sandra. And while the guests were still there, Enrique suddenly remembered something. He said that he had been busy all the time with what they asked for, apologized for the delay, but it seemed that he could finally introduce them to each other. The main heroine smiled enthusiastically and sincerely thanked the guild leader. Soon, even before the tavern opened, Marissa came down to the common hall with the baby in her arms, yawning widely. Millie followed her downstairs, smiled at the sight, and thought that, as she suspected, her mother was clearly not getting enough sleep. Since Zick was born, Marissa woke up every night to check if he was okay, and when the main heroine was just as tiny, her mother did exactly the same. Millie remembered being told that Marissa and Joe's first child was a girl named Lisa, who supposedly suddenly died in her sleep one night. The girl looked sadly at the woman with dark circles under her eyes, exhausted from lack of sleep, but still gently rocking the baby, and perhaps this mother became so anxious precisely because she had already lost a child once and did not want it to happen again. Millie really wanted Marissa to be able to rest a little and not worry about the end. That is how they got a new employee. That day, a guy slightly older than Millie approached her, introduced himself as Nate, and said that from today he would work at the Shady Cat Inn. Smiling, he added that he hoped they would get along well. Millie stepped forward, smiling at the guy, and Joe stood a little behind, crossing his arms over his chest, and also greeted him. Do not forget, the Trade Guild recommended several truly talented candidates to them. And Joe, after several interviews, decided to hire Nate. Millie crossed her arms over her chest, touched by the thought that now she would not be the only one cleaning, and even excitedly imagined that the suspicious cat would now be able to afford a better employee who would live at the house. Joe approached the girl and addressed the young man, saying that she was also very glad to see him. They explained that Millie would teach him everything he needed to know, and added that although she was small, she was very responsible. The main heroine smiled warmly, introduced herself, and said she was very glad to meet him. Joe laughed awkwardly, scratched his head, and said that regarding the room for overnight stay, they had all been so busy that they simply did not have time to clean it properly. He added that there was still enough time before breakfast, so he wanted Nate and Millie to do it together. The main heroine approached the young man, nodded to her father, task accepted, and pointing to the stairs, said that they could go and start. As she climbed the stairs, she waved her hand and explained that he could choose any room on the 3rd floor, and the new employee thanked her with a smile, his eyes wide open with curiosity as he looked around. When they reached the 3rd floor, Millie felt that this floor had always been empty and no one had used it until now. That is why she herself had never stepped there. Benchy decisively opened the door. The entire corridor was overgrown with cobwebs and covered with a thick layer of dust. Abandoned things lay everywhere. The main character slammed the door in an instant. Frowning, she panicked. She thought that besides dust and cobwebs, there was also mold here, and she could not come to terms with this reality. Confused, she mumbled an apology and explained that she shouldn't have called him here when there was such a terrible mess. But Nate just smiled broadly, clenched his fists, resolutely, shining with joy, and said he would do everything possible to clean up. Millie looked at him in surprise and thought that he seemed like a very good person. Later, the main heroine sat in the kitchen and strangely muttered that there was an incredible amount of dust here. She thought to herself that she couldn't use a cleansing spell with Nate around, so she would have to do everything by hand, and it turned out to be incredibly difficult. Joe laughed, gently tousled his daughter's hair, said he could see how tired she was, handed her a mug of tea, and thanked both of them for their help. He snorted and asked which room their new employee finally chose. Millie replied that she had recommended the largest one with a wide window, but Nate took the one at the very end of the corridor. She muttered that it was probably cozy to live there, and a sudden exclamation interrupted their conversation. Nate bit into today's breakfast a sandwich with an orc patty, and joy immediately lit up in his eyes. He asked what kind of dish it was, and exclaimed that it was incredibly tasty and that he was trying it for the first time. Joe and Millie, already used to such food, looked at his reaction with only slight surprise. The girl with the dirty face thought, of course, the food at Shady Cat was head or even two heads better than any other tavern. Then the head of the Iskra family spoke again. He said that after breakfast it would be time to wash the dishes, and when the children finished, they would face the usual morning chores: laundry or cleaning the rooms from which guests had recently left. After breakfast, Millie and Nate went up to the third floor again. The girl addressed the boy with the respectful suffix "san," but he gently interrupted her, saying it was not necessary, she was his senior companion here. The main heroine laughed, lifted the bucket, and said they could start cleaning right now, then corrected herself she would take care of the rooms herself, and Nate would handle the corridor. He picked up the broom standing nearby and resolutely said that he could be relied upon. Millie entered the first room and, making sure the boy was not looking, began to clean. She muttered that this was her chance. In the very next moment, she repeated the spell, cleansing, several times. Before she could even blink, the room became impeccably clean. She thought with satisfaction that cleansing was truly a useful thing. Then, with the most innocent expression on her face, she left again, whistling a light melody. Nate turned to her in surprise, muttered that she was very fast, and asked if she was already finished. Millie awkwardly scratched her head and laughed, saying she was just very skilled at cleaning, and added that he could keep the corridor, and she would clean the other rooms herself. The main character began to dust. Nate did not take his eyes off her. He noticed that she was so mature and independent. The girl turned to him in surprise. The boy continued and said that she was only a little older than his younger brother, but already so responsible. Millie asked if he had brothers or sisters. Without stopping sweeping, he answered that he had an older brother and sister, but they both worked in another restaurant, so now they all lived separately. Nate wanted to become independent so that they could live together again. For a moment his face darkened, and he muttered that he wanted to do it as soon as possible. Millie became a little worried and asked if something had happened to him. Nate turned to her, apologized, and smiled again, said that everything was fine, and then suggested continuing the cleaning. The girl nodded uncertainly. She thought that for a moment a real sadness flashed across the boy's face, but decided that maybe she just imagined it. Several months had passed since Zick's birthday. Millie was already 6 years old, and Zick was 6 months old. When the main heroine looked at her little brother, she couldn't help but think. He was getting cuter every day, especially when he was in a kitten costume and playing with a toy kitten. Joe and Nate stood nearby. The man noticed that it seemed the boy was already used to the job. He smiled and replied that it was all because Millie was a very good teacher, and the girl thought that Nate was learning quickly and had already settled in the dubious tavern Shady Cat. The boy continued and added that the best thing for him here was the staff food. It was simply incredibly tasty. For example, today for lunch they had fluffies or croquettes. Joe laughed good-naturedly and said that it was because his daughter constantly invented new recipes, and Millie added that their menu had also significantly expanded, and regular customers were delighted with the changes. Joe confirmed her words. Fortunately, their tavern was really thriving. He added that now he could calmly entrust part of the work to Nate, and was even thinking of hiring a couple more people to serve customers. Millie gladly said, "Why not?" At these words, Nate looked at them in surprise, then tensely bit his lip and thought for a moment. Joe noticed this and asked if something was wrong. The boy replied no, nothing, thanked for the food, and said he would go clean. The main character looked after him in surprise and thought that Nate looked a little upset. In a few days, the hall was packed with people, and there was not a single free table. Suddenly, one of the guests noticed that he was given the wrong change. Nate panicked, instantly apologized, and rushed to fix the mistake, whispering apologies again and again, and the client kindly replied that it was nothing serious, it happens to everyone. Millie approached to clear the neighboring table and thought that Nate rarely makes mistakes. Then the guy came up, apologized, and promised to take the dishes himself. The girl sincerely thanked him. Looking closely, she noticed that after that conversation about hiring new employees, Nate had become a bit distracted and tired. She felt that something was wrong. She stepped up to him and called him by name. Nate, gathering plates, looked at her with his usual smile and asked what she wanted, and Millie, hesitating, opened her mouth to say something. But Joe shouted from behind the counter that the orders were ready and asked Nate to quickly bring the dishes. The guy immediately lit up and rushed to fulfill the request. Millie realized that now was not the time to argue. She needed to return to work, and she hoped she had just imagined it. Meanwhile, Nate laughed awkwardly, picking up several plates from the table. Suddenly, a loud crash sounded when the main character turned around. Nate was already lying on the floor, barely breathing. Broken plates with orders were scattered around him. The girl rushed to him, and Joe followed her. Soon Nate was lying on the bed in his room, where Joe had carried him. He finally came to his senses and saw Millie sitting nearby, and Nate laughed awkwardly and tried to calm her down, apologizing that he had been sleeping poorly lately, but now everything was fine and he could move. He tried to get up, but the girl instantly rushed to him and wrapped him in a blanket again. When he asked to be released, she cut him off, saying that he absolutely could not get up now and that the suspicious cat was to blame for everything, who did not care about the health of his employee, and then with a firm intonation declared that today he must rest properly. Nate laughed again, this time more gently, and said that only the main character could be so caring, and Millie seriously added that she wanted Shady Cat Inn to become a place with a transparent, working atmosphere, accidentally using a word from her native world. Her eyes shone, and even more decisively, with full confidence, she declared that they would do everything in their power to support their dear employees, both current and future. Nate froze in place, his hands folded over the blanket, and asked confusedly what she meant by transparent. Millie was silent for a few seconds, ignored the question, and then hesitantly turned back to the boy. She apologized if she was wrong, but since her father talked about hiring additional workers, she felt that something was bothering him. She said that maybe this explained his insomnia. Nate fell silent, tense, and Millie suddenly realized she was right. She continued, saying that this boy had always worked very hard and paid attention to every detail. Since he joined the team, he had greatly helped that suspicious cat in. His father, mother, and even she herself considered Nate an important link in their business. Then she took his hands and squeezed them tightly, saying that if he had any problems, they would all help him. The boy thanked her emotionally, and his eyes glistened a little. A few days later, everyone from the Spark family and Nate gathered in one room. Marissa sat by the cradle, Millie and Joe settled on the sofa, and Nate on the other sofa opposite them. He folded his hands in front of him and awkwardly thanked everyone for finding time to meet with him. Joe crossed his arms over his chest and gently asked him to calm down. He nodded and continued. It turned out he did not need younger brother and sister at all. 10-year-old Kate and 5-year-old Mark now work together in the same restaurant, but they are treated very badly there, and they have long been asking their older brother for advice and help. At these words, Joe's face darkened. He seriously asked where they worked. When he heard in response, "It's in Mangacaps," Millie froze for a few seconds. She recalled that terrible encounter with the owner who once demanded from them the recipe for Orc Katsu. Could it be that the children worked for such a person in that dreadful establishment? Nate began telling her that he had secretly visited the restaurant recently to check on the younger ones. They were forced to work until they dropped. According to them, they had to work late into the night and then clean the entire place. Then the boy, barely hiding his anger, added that lately some customers had started harassing his sister. Marissa and Joe exchanged heavy glances, and their faces became even sterner. Millie Grimace could not understand how this could have happened. They were just a 10-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy. It was disgusting, and the customers in that place were probably terrible. Joe was tense and serious, asked that boy if he knew the terms of their contract, because if the agreement was officially signed, taking Kate and Mark before it ends would be very difficult. Nate replied that there was no official contract, because otherwise they would have had to pay a fixed salary. And Mark had just turned 5, so it seemed he didn't have a written contract at all. After all, he was taller when he was still 4. To work legally in this country, one must conclude a labor contract, and the trade guild oversees everything, from setting the minimum wage to drafting agreements. Usually, children under 5 years old are simply not taken for official work. All this made Millie cross her arms over her chest. She was irritated and almost furious. It turned out that Kate and Mark worked in completely inhumane conditions. Then she asked Nate about their parents. The boy turned away and began to tell her. His mother died shortly after the birth of the younger brother Marcy, and very soon the father remarried, but the stepmother began to cruelly abuse Kate and Mark. Nate had already left home and was working, and the father simply ordered both of them to work at Mangacaps. Joe frowned and asked if their father said anything about the lack of a formal contract. Nate quietly whispered that no, then began to explain. Actually, the reason why even his 5-year-old little brother ended up there was that. Because their father simply sold both children to Mangacaps to get rid of the burden. He pronounced these last words with particular fury, and his voice trembled with uncontrollable emotion. Millie frowns seriously and looks at the boy with deep sympathy. Nate continued and added that even if his younger brothers and sisters ran away, they simply had nowhere to return to. Joe exchanged a glance with his daughter and summarized. So, the boy's father forced the children to work against their will, and behind their backs made some deal with the owner of Mangacaps. The main character confirmed this, saying that the owner of the establishment probably just wanted cheap and obedient workers. Tears welled up in Nate's eyes, but he resolutely stated that he was already 16, and now he could become the official guardian of his younger brothers and sisters, so he wants to take them away from there. Millie recalled when it came to hiring new employees, he probably thought about his brother and sister, and was afraid that it would bring extra trouble to the suspicious cat inside. That is why he was silent. Suddenly Joe stood up from his seat and sighed heavily. This was how he showed that he understood everything. He crossed the room and approached the young man. Everyone present watched him with surprise. Nate awkwardly apologized once again for making them listen to all this. Suddenly Joe patted him on the back and with a broad encouraging smile asked him to bring his brother and sister as soon as possible. Marissa and Millie looked at this with tenderness. Nate looked at the man uncertainly and asked in a doubtful voice if that was really allowed. Joe nodded confidently. He approached his wife and said that since they were the sister and brother of their employee, they could be safely trusted with this job. Marissa smiled brightly and nodded in agreement, saying that they were already planning to hire new employees. He had struggled alone for a long time, and now there were people nearby ready to help him. These thoughts and relief brought tears to his eyes again. He did not hold them back, wiped them with his sleeve, and sincerely thanked the entire Spark family. The couple approached him. Joe patted him on the shoulder. Marissa sat next to him on the edge of the sofa, and Millie sat on the other side and gently stroked his hand. When the young man calmed down a little, Joe leaned toward him and said that since everything was decided, they needed to hurry. He announced that the work for today was finished, and it was time to leave, and Nate thanked everyone once again, this time more firmly. The protagonist's father thought with displeasure that the tavern owner was clearly suspicious, so just in case it was better to hire security. That very evening, a familiar adventurer came to the tavern, Mr. Zach. Joe sincerely greeted him and was glad, and Zach smiled in a friendly way, said he had already heard about their trouble, asked to leave the security issue to him, and reassured that there was no need to worry about payment. He was happy to help. The head of the family said that this adventure appeared just at the right moment, but was he really sure about his decision? Zach laughed out loud and confirmed it, explaining that a dangerous kidnapper had recently appeared in the district. He was entrusted with the investigation, so he would stay in these parts anyway. Then Zach turned to the heroine and said that, according to rumors, the kidnapper had not yet been caught, so she needed to be especially careful. The girl nodded seriously in agreement. Then the adventurer returned to Nate and said that they could go. Millie decisively stood up, mentally deciding that they were going to Mangacaps. And so began the operation to rescue Nate's sister and brother. So to save Nate's sister and brother, they rushed to that tavern. Millie approached the exit door and grabbed the handle. At that moment, the father grabbed her by the hand and asked where she was going, whether she was really going with Zach and Nate. Millie still reached for the door, confident that she would go with them, but the father, with a firm but gentle smile, said that she would stay home, and that was that. The girl turned to him with a disappointed look and asked why. Joe replied that it would be dangerous, so she could not go. It was obvious. Zach interrupted their conversation, awkwardly but kindly told her not to worry. He and Nate would definitely bring back her younger brothers and sisters. Millie looked irritably at the adults and thought that they probably think she will only bring them trouble. She exhaled and resigned to the situation, thought that there was nothing to be done. She would have to trust Zach. Meanwhile, the traveler approached Nate, said they could move on, and Nate nodded impatiently in anticipation. Standing in the doorway, the main character shouted to the boy and sincerely wished him luck and a safe journey. Nate turned back, raised a clenched fist, and with a confident smile on his face full of determination. Several hours flew by, and it was already getting dark. The entire Spark couple sat in the common room, mechanically cleaning and waiting for their return. Millie tensely thought that Nate and Zach should return soon, as she hoped. Suddenly, the door opened. Mr. Zach appeared in the doorway and announced that they had returned. Nate followed, looking back over his shoulder with a gentle, joyful smile. he quietly told his younger siblings brother Mark and sister Kate that they had arrived. Millie looked at the children in her eyes mixed compassion and horror. They clung to Nate in fear, trying to be as close to him as possible. Their hands and faces were covered with scratches, bruises, and abrasions, silent witnesses to how they had been treated all this time. The main heroine smiled happily, jumped to the children, and welcomed them home. She explained that they were just about to have dinner and invited everyone to sit together. Then she rushed to the table. She picked up the plate with apple chips, turned around, and with the warmest smile handed it to the children. They glanced at each other uncertainly and looked at their older brother Nate. He leaned towards them and gently said that they could try a little. Kate and Mark carefully took a piece and bit into it. Their eyes instantly lit up with surprise. They whispered that it was incredibly tasty, and Millie gently watched their reaction. Then she introduced herself as the owner's daughter and extended her hand. She said she was very glad to meet them. The children, a little embarrassed, shook her hand. The adults watched this and quietly smiled. A little later, when everyone was sitting down to dinner, Joe took Mr. Zach to the kitchen to discuss how everything went. He thanked the traveler for his help, and Zach, crossing his arms over his chest, said he was glad everything was resolved peacefully. When Joe handed him a cup of tea, Zach began to tell the story, and when he and Nate arrived at the tavern, it was already closed. The owner was not there, and inside were only his wife and son. Nate approached them, introduced himself as the brother of Kate and Mark, and politely asked to see the younger ones, but the owner's son grumbled discontentedly that they were busy preparing for the next day and told them to go away. Nate insisted, saying he just wanted to see them, but they began to rudely drive them off. Watching this quarrel, Zach could no longer stand it. He pushed the man aside, roughly apologizing for his harshness, and sharply opened the door leading deeper into the room. The owner's son stammered, asked who he was, but Zach ignored him. He began loudly calling Kate and Mark, shouting that their brother had come to see them. For a few seconds, silence prevailed. He was quiet and timid. He did not come through the door. Finally, the door was locked from the outside. He cut the chain with a sword, burst open the door, and saw two frightened children crying. The older girl was shielding the little boy with her body. They were locked in a small, almost empty room. Zach reached out his hand to the children and said they could leave now. But at that moment, the innkeeper's son jumped up to them and shouted, "What right do you have to take his workers?" He waved his hand and blurted out that the girl Kate was his fiancée. Zach quickly grabbed his hand. He twisted it and sharply pressed the rowdy man against the wall. In a threatening voice, he warned that if the man continued to cause trouble, he would immediately call the guards, and then everyone would suffer. The man muttered something indistinctly, but no longer resisted and let them go. Zach finished the story. Joe, crossing his arms over his chest, muttered that it was good that he had indeed asked Mr. Zach to accompany Nate. Nate himself approached them, and bitterly added that it seemed the owner of that tavern had simply declared Kate the fiancée of his son and was forcing her to work for free. She is usually kept locked up, only let out during working hours. Then the boy lowered his head and sadly said that the younger ones should have been saved much earlier. Noticing that reaction, Millie tugged her father's sleeve as if reminding him of something. Joe nodded. He said that before the situation became even more complicated, he wanted to officially sign a work contract with Kate and Mark and asked Nate if he had any objections. The boy looked at the man with emotion. Barely holding back his emotions, he replied, "No, of course I agree." Millie looked at her father with a grateful smile. Kate and Mark have been living at Shadowcat Inn for a week. Soon they began to recover from what they had experienced and looked much better, all thanks to the support. Although they were still not ready to start work, Joe and Millie immediately decided to make everything official. For this, they all went to the guild together. Now they were safe. At least that's what Millie thought until a certain day came. Suddenly, in the middle of the day, the tavern doors suddenly burst open. The owner of Mangacaps entered the hall, threateningly called Kate, and gestured for her to come out to him immediately. Joe approached the owner of the main computer and said seriously, but politely, that, unfortunately, that man would not be able to meet those he was looking for. He added that he was disturbing his clients and asked him to leave. After these words, the henchman who came with the master began stomping the furniture with a crash, scattering everything around and shouting fiercely. They moved further into the hall, and the owner of Mangacaps became angry and shouted wildly, "Who stole my workers? How dare he?" Joe raised his voice, stepped forward, and replied, "Don't talk nonsense. We never considered Kate and Mark real workers." Suddenly, one of the visitors, a traveler, intervened in their dispute and addressed the old master, causing a vein to appear on his bald head, and he angrily asked how he was called. The adventurer also lost patience and barked, "If that man is not going to eat, let him go away." Other visitors immediately picked up the shout, exclaiming that the traveler was right, the noise would spoil the taste of the food, and demanded that the uninvited guests leave. The man frowned fiercely. Suddenly turning sharply, he headed for the exit and, leaving, said that the show would still return his former workers. Millie stood by the stairs, confused, watching the whole scene, but did not dare to come closer so as not to get in the way. When the uninvited guests left, Joe approached the guests and bowed apologetically, thanking them for standing up for him. The traveler waved his hand with a smile and said that it was nothing serious. Bad rumors had long been circulating about mangacaps, so this suspicious cat was just unlucky to get involved with him. Suddenly Millie heard muffled crying from above. She rushed up the stairs, worrying about Kate and Mark. She sharply opened the door to their room and found the children on the floor. Kate was holding her younger brother tightly, covering him with her body, and the main character shouted their names. The children turned to her, tears shining in their eyes. Millie looked anxiously at what was happening. She knelt before them and gently hugged both. In a quiet but firm voice, she said that everything was fine now and no one would harm them. She felt how strongly Kate was trembling. Pure, icy anger flared up in her heart. How could adults scare a child like that? She would never forgive that old scoundrel for this. Millie quickly went downstairs and on the way shouted to her father that she was going out for a moment to sprinkle salt on the threshold for cleansing. Joe wanted to ask her again, or even forbid her to go out after everything that had happened, but his daughter had already disappeared behind the door. The main character stepped away from the tavern and began looking around. She thought those people definitely had not yet returned to mangacaps, but suddenly in one of the alleys she noticed familiar figures, exactly those who had caused the riot. Making sure no one was following, Millie cast a wind spell. She silently climbed onto the roof of the nearest house, and no one there would notice her. She frowned, looking at the group below, and thought that these people would be perfect for testing the magic she had just mastered. As soon as the men stopped to discuss something, Millie uttered a spell of darkness, and instantly they were enveloped by an impenetrable dark dome. The girl mentally explained to herself that thanks to the soundproof effect of dark magic, no one would now hear their screams, and seeing the result, she exclaimed with satisfaction to herself. So she decided to start with water magic and created several large water spheres. And she carefully moved them right onto the head of the owner of mangacaps. His henchmen watched in horror as their boss choked and cursed wildly, try to understand what the hell is going on. In a moment, the dark dome dissipated, and the men, wet and confused, began nervously looking around. Meanwhile, Millie looked down at them with a cold smile. Then she aimed and fired several tiny but burning tongues of flame, precisely synchronizing the movements of each of their eyebrows. They screamed in fear and pain, unsuccessfully slapping their faces in attempts to extinguish the fire and shouting that it was unbearably hot. "What is happening?" Millie smiled broadly, listening to their screams. Compared to how Kate and Mark suffered, these men got off very lightly. Then she quietly whispered that maybe they had enough for today, but this was not the end yet, and allowed them to flee in panic. And then she decided to practice a little more control over her magic, and it turned out to be really useful. A little later in mangacaps, the innkeeper angrily drank something strong from the mug, then threw it on the table. He shouted cursed, asking what kind of devilry this was, and added that that bastard from that suspicious cat had completely lost control. Suddenly he heard footsteps behind and his son entered the room. The man couldn't stand it. He had finally returned. And asked if he had submitted the contract to the guild. The boy awkwardly stammered, looking away. He said that by his father's order, he tried to submit a contract with forged signatures of Kate and Mark, but he was told, the children already have a valid work contract, and they refused to take a new one. He tried to find out which establishment the contract was with, but the guild stubbornly remained silent. The boy was interrupted by his father, took another sip, and shouted that it was obvious. It was that suspicious, shady cat in. Taking a new mug with displeasure, he grumbled that the sparks interfere with his affairs and won't calm down until he makes them pay. Suddenly, he understood. That scoundrel from Shadicat had a daughter. At that thought, a sly, predatory smile spread across his face. After that midday clash with the people from mangacaps, Joe became much more cautious and hired adventurers to stand watch at night. During the day, their restaurant was often visited by regular customers, the same adventurers, so if something happened, they would definitely help. In any case, the main heroine in a child's body could not stay alert at night, so this became a great help. And so, in such a tense situation, when it seemed that the villains were hunting her around the clock, it became a bit creepy. One time she went for a walk in the forest near her house with friends Mike and Nina, and from around the corner, two men with burnt eyebrows, broken by life and with openly sinister faces, were watching them. Someone noticed them and stood up, shouting to the main heroine and asking who they were. Nina, clutching the wreath she had just woven in her hands, fearfully added that they had been watching them for a long time. Millie snorted, approached, and said that they were probably pedophiles. Again, Micah store. The girl hugged Nina, waved her hand toward him, and mockingly explained that they were called perverts. When they started to move, the men who gathered to follow them were suddenly caught and spun around on the spot by a strong gust of wind, and Millie, seeing this, smiled smugly. A little later again, in Mangacaps, the men who were chasing Millie barely dragged their feet and held onto each other, approached the bar, shouted to the boss that they could go no further, and someone hysterically added that if anyone approached that girl, there would definitely be trouble, because every time they enter that suspicious inn, something bad happens. The tavern owner did not even turn around, just grumbled over his shoulder that it was nonsense, took a sip from his mug, and continued stirring the food in the pan, then asked how much longer they were going to complain about one girl. The workers rushed to interrupt each other and vigorously convince him that it was true and that even just approaching a suspicious cat in the mint patch was a risk of injury, and the tavern keeper sighed irritably and called them useless. Then he transferred the food to a plate, put it on the table, and muttered that he just had a brilliant idea. He gloomily added that he would handle the rest himself. A few days later, when the night was already deep, Millie came down from the room, still half asleep, to drink some water. Yawning widely, she was only surprised. These villains came every day tirelessly and now suddenly stopped. Every day she drove them away with magic, but this sudden silence also gave her no peace. Suddenly she heard a suspicious noise from below, rushed around the corner, not reaching the very bottom, and cautiously peeked, wondering if some guest had returned so late. Then she heard the night watchman, an adventurer, tell 4 men that, unfortunately, guests were no longer accepted at this hour. He apologized and asked him to leave. Suddenly, one of the men approached him and pulled a small but heavy stick from his sleeve. He hit him on the head with all his might. The traveler quietly fell to the floor, unconscious. Millie watched, gripped by horror. Looking closely, she realized that one of the men was the owner of Mangacaps himself, and the others were obviously his mercenaries. The leader, the one who knocked out that guy, took off his hood, showed a scarred face, and said that the people they came for were on the 3rd or 4th floor, so they had to be quiet. It would be unpleasant if the other night watchmen noticed them. Then another mercenary with a nasty smile muttered that the innkeeper's wife was supposedly a real beauty, and if he found her, could he have fun with her. The chief mercenary smiled, took out a dagger, turned to the owner of the main computer, and said he would return his former employees to him, and with the rest they would do whatever they wished. The owner of the main computer smiled wickedly and nodded. He added that 2 children from that suspicious cat needed to be captured and sold into slavery. While the 4 men discussed the details in quiet voices, Millie quietly crept around the corner and pressed her back to the wall. She thought that this time that vile old man had brought others with him, they looked like experienced, dangerous thugs. She did not want anyone to get hurt. They needed to be stopped somehow. The main heroine waved her hands, thinking that her magic would reach them from this distance. She peeked out again, trying to remain unnoticed, and mentally uttered the spell Earth. She prepared a set of traps for them. Sharp, though small, spikes grew on each step. The chief mercenary quietly reminded his men, who were moving toward the stairs, not to make a sound. One of them mockingly said not to worry. You placed his foot on the first step, and as soon as he stepped on it, he loudly screamed in pain. He immediately covered his mouth with one hand and began rubbing the pierced foot with the other. The scarred mercenary leader hissed threateningly at him and whispered angrily that he had ordered them to be quiet. Then he summoned a small ball of light that illuminated the stairs, but there was nothing there. Fortunately, Millie managed to remove the spikes, so no one noticed anything. The chief mercenary sighed deeply, waved his hand, and said there was nothing there, signaling to proceed. They did not waste time, and the main hero frowned because they were not going to give up at all. So she decided to act differently and cast a darkness spell on 2 other mercenaries who were already climbing the stairs ahead. They froze for a few seconds in complete impenetrable darkness, not understanding what was happening. One of them rushed to summon light, but the spell did not work. Inside the sphere of darkness, his magic was powerless. Millie sat on her knees, hands folded in front of her, thinking of only one thing: her magic must be enough. She promised herself never to let anyone even touch her dear family again. Meanwhile, the mercenary trapped in the sphere of darkness was still vainly trying to summon light. He cursed, not understanding why nothing was working. Suddenly, a strange rustle sounded ahead, and the second mercenary panicked and asked what that sound was. The first muttered that he didn't know there was absolute darkness around and ordered a retreat. The mercenary commander heard these words. He rushed to the door and tried to open it, but nothing worked, and he shouted nervously that the door was jammed. It simply would not budge. He muttered as if the very earth was preventing him from turning the handle. He shouted to the others that escape was impossible. The window was also blocked, as if it had been bricked up. One of the mercenaries muttered, confused, "I don't understand what's happening here." At that moment, something suddenly grabbed him. He knocked him, pushed him to the floor with all his might, and pinned him down, depriving him of the ability to move. He tried to shout something but couldn't, and the second mercenary, trying to free him, shouted that the ropes were as hard as stone and would not give at all. Meanwhile, the mercenary, who remained on the stairs, tried again to summon light. This time he succeeded. He breathed a sigh of relief, raised the light up, and saw before him a huge black spider named Harry. His legs gave way from fear, and he fell headlong down. The chief mercenary screamed in horror and panic. What kind of monster is this, and where did it come from? He swore and asked angrily, wasn't this supposed to be a trifle? Millie laughed quietly, watching how she managed to scare them so much. The chief mercenary heard her quiet laughter, looked up the stairs and saw a girl there. Rage flared within him and he shouted, "Is that all we do?" The main heroine ran away, but had not taken more than a few steps when the man caught up with her and grabbed her, squeezing her hands so hard that her bones cracked. The chief mercenary roughly grabbed Millie by the hand and raised it into the air, growling that she had mocked them enough and would now pay for it. The girl screamed in pain. She turned to him and firmly demanded that he let her go. The man only snorted contemptuously in response and declared that he would take her with him. The main heroine began to warn him threateningly, but her words were cut off. Suddenly the bandit felt a strange tickling on his skin. He looked down and saw with horror hundreds of tiny black spiders crawling on his arms and legs. He threw Millie away, wildly shaking his limbs and shouting that they wouldn't fall off. The girl fell, hit her head, and groaned in pain. At that moment, the voice of the owner Mangacapi rang out pale and frightened. He declared that he was leaving immediately. The main heroine, having overcome dizziness, stood up. She mentally ordered the huge magical spider to block the exit. The man barely managed to dodge Harry's paws and shouted that she was a cheeky little girl. Millie simply frowned in response. The spider pressed the scoundrel to the floor. She wrapped him with strong stone ropes. She thought she would never forgive him for the threat he posed to her home. The owner of mangacap began to struggle in vain, thrashing helplessly. It demanded to be released. In response, Millie called the wind. A burst of magic made her hair stand on end. She easily jumped over the railing and softly descended. She shouted that he would get what he deserved and hit him right in the face with a lump of magical water. The man choked and began to suffocate, his body convulsing. Through hoarse breath, he barely managed to whisper a plea, "Stop." Wiz's resistance finally weakened. Millie fell to the floor and exhaled deeply, wiping sweat from her forehead. The silence that followed the noise of the fight seemed simply deafening. Then the girl lifted one of the tiny spiders onto her finger and mentally thanked them for their help. Thus the Operation Arachophobia, carried out with the help of earth magic, was successfully completed. A barely audible groan sounded behind her. Millie sharply turned and rushed to the fallen adventurer. He was still unconscious, and in this situation that was even for the better. All that remained for her was to remove the soundproof sphere of black magic and, using wind magic, slightly distort her own voice. The heroine cleared her throat. With all her might she shouted for help. The guests began to wake up from the noise, not understanding what was happening. Joe, hearing his daughter's voice, instantly jumped up. Marissa, holding Zeke's clothes, ran after him. Nate also woke up in his room. Everyone slowly began to descend downstairs, frozen in confusion. The first to arrive were adventurers. They froze in shock. Unfamiliar men lay on the floor in strange poses. Whatever the reason, the guards had to be called immediately. Joe and Marissa came down next. They were wildly calling their daughter's name, asking where she was. Millie peeked around the corner and told her father that she was here and had just been to the bathroom. The parents rushed to her and hugged her tightly, whispering words of relief and thanking heaven, and Joe added in a trembling voice that when he couldn't find her in the room, he almost died of fear. Nate came down last. He looked around confused and froze when he recognized one of the tied-up men, the owner of Mangacap. Horror ran across his face, and he began mumbling to Joe that it was all his fault because of his problems. The Spark couple frowned and almost simultaneously shouted that he was not to blame at all. Then Joe, having calmed down, exhaled and said, "The main thing is that everyone is alive and safe." Night fell and the investigation began. Bart stood in the hall interrogating the owners and guests of the suspicious tavern, Cat Inn, and everyone confirmed upon hearing the scream. They went downstairs and found the robbers lying unconscious. Then the knight turned to the girl and explained. It was she who left the room that night, and regarding the master's name, the main heroine gave her full name and nodded in agreement. Knight asked if she heard anything suspicious, and Millie replied that she only heard a cry for help, but was so frightened that she hid the whole time. She mentally noted that during the scuffle she used black magic to muffle the sounds, so she could pretend that, like everyone else, she did not hear the robbers' voices. When left alone, she thought the guards should believe that the adventurers on duty had repelled the attackers themselves, although due to injuries, they did not remember the details. Knight Bart muttered confusedly that he did not understand at all what had happened here. Subordinate added that he tried to interrogate the detainees, but they only panicked and muttered something incoherent about spiders. Bart kept insisting to his colleague that the owner of Manko Cutie seemed not even to realize the seriousness of his crime. He conspired with one of the criminals. This was clearly not just petty mischief. Hearing this, Millie thought that these criminals were exactly those whom ZAC had mentioned earlier. Bart noted that the reports indicated their possible presence in the Eastern District, but he did not expect them to be caught in such a strange way. Millie watched the conversation intently, genuinely interested. Bart picked up on this and looked at the girl intently, with obvious displeasure. She froze in confusion, thinking that everything was bad. Their eyes met. Millie immediately put on the most innocent grimace on her face and stepped aside. The knights finished the inspection and headed to the exit. The younger one stumbled and quietly asked the elder if he noticed anything strange. The elder closed his eyes for a moment and replied that no, nothing unusual. It was time for them to go. When they left, the main heroine froze in place. It seemed to her that they still suspected her of something, but one way or another the matter was now closed. She quietly laughed with relief. When she calmed down, reality returned to her. Her gaze fell on the neglected room and suddenly a new thought struck her. What to do with all this now? To be continued. Thank you for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you liked the story, like and subscribe. See you soon.